All right. I am now joined by several people, some of whom you should know if you tune into these regularly. So we have Victor Bruzzone from Plastic Pills and Other Places. Ethan, the better known by his Twitter and YouTube sobriquet, Mouthy Infidel, which is the one time you get me actually saying that on air. And new to the GTAA extended universe, but not new to me. I actually saw him in person when I was in Toronto. Gordon Katic. How do you say that?
More or less. I mean, technically it's Katic, and my Balkan friends would say it appropriately, but most don't. So I just mostly go by Katic. But thanks, Ben. Happy to be here.
Outstanding. So yeah, this is. I should also say, so there are various new developments with some of these people since the last time we saw them. Want to get into that in just a minute, but first, Victor, you're the one who found this debate, so you want to tell me a little bit about what this is?
Yeah, for sure. So I was actually at this debate live. It's kind of a Toronto institution, this Munk debate thing. I guess it's been going on for I don't know how many years. I want to say like at least since the 90s. Gordon, maybe you know better like how long it's been around for. But it's just these like different debates on issues, and they're famous for kind of bringing in a lot of like well-known thinkers on the topics. And this one, just given what was going on recently with like the Twitter files, I think this actually happened right before the Twitter files thing dropped. And one of the debaters is Matt Taibbi. And yeah, I mean, I thought it was just an interesting topic. And I think like nowadays in kind of this online media landscape, this question of like the mainstream media and alternative media seems super relevant to me. So I thought it would be like an interesting debate. And when I was there, I thought it was pretty fun. And there were like some spicy moments. I also just really like the way the Munk debate is structured. It's very disciplined compared to some of the other debates that we've watched and we've broken down together. They're like extremely disciplined. And I remember like being there in person, I was like impressed by the fact that like as soon as the timer went out, like the audience is instructed to just start clapping. Like, so they just clap over the person. So they literally just have to stop talking because they get drowned out by claps. So it's like very disciplined, which I appreciate.
They do like the Oscars wrap it up music.
Exactly.
Yeah. I feel like the Munk debate in like the Toronto imaginary figures as this place for like edgy questions for normies kind of thing. Like it's a very kind of mainstream and popular institution. And from my sort of cursory following of it lately, it's been getting like more and more controversial in terms of the speakers that it invites. So Steve Bannon famously was a Munk debater to much protestation. Zizek and Peterson were, and so it's getting interesting, I think.
Was Zizek ever there? I didn't know that. I know Peterson did that debate on like, and I think the proposition that was like 3 years ago about like, has political correctness gone too far?
Maybe I was confusing it with the other Toronto debate. I actually might. There was another one,
but so which wasn't a Munk debate technically. Right. Yeah,
it wasn't a Munk debate. I did watch the Steve Bannon one, which is kind of funny to me because that happened, if I'm remembering right, that was like either fall 2019 or right at the top of 2020, if it was 2020. It was definitely pre-COVID. But like what was really striking to me about it is because I watched it, I thought it was kind of empty. Like so he was there, he was debating David Frum, who's like the sort of ultimate neocon turned never Trumper, kind of resistance lib hero from the Trump era, but like he was also infamously he was the speechwriter for George W. Bush, who wrote the Axis of Evil speech. And what was really striking about it to me was the contrast, because like a few months later, the podcast Red Scare had Steve Bannon on, which was, also controversial, as you might imagine, especially because that was when, for if you don't know, there's no reason anybody should actually, but but since I do, so Red Scare is sort of cultural commentary, and there's always an element of politics. It became more political. Back in 2019, it was sort of, I think, seen as kind of vaguely aligned with the sort of Bernie adjacent left. It probably, to be honest, as much as anything, because one of the girls who hosted it was dating one of the guys from Cumtown at the time, right? So it was there's a sort of chain of association. It was 2 weeks away from Chapo or something.
Well, and there's also that famous meme, right, where she was dressed as a Sailor Moon girl at a Bernie rally and talking to Alex Jones, and she said, "We just want healthcare. Why are there worms in your brain?" kind of thing. So I think that was one big moment for Red Scare.
Totally right, and that was, I mean, I would listen to it every once in a while. I mean, and it would definitely had I don't know that they were exactly ideologically consistent leftists, but they were roughly friendly to what Bernie was selling, and there was certainly a big left-wing audience at one point, and and I think over the course of time they drifted in a much more new righty kind of. I mean, I think they had Alex Jones on as a guest eventually, right? But one of the co-hosts, Dasha, was on this show in 2020, and at that point, she still said, my interview with her, she was still saying some very leftist things in the interview. I mean, I don't think she expressed any particularly remarkable or unusual opinions in that time. They certainly drifted in a different direction that I don't follow it closely, but it seems much more now. But the point about the Munk debate is if you contrast those two, the David Frum, Steve Bannon Munk debate and the Steve Bannon Red Scare appearance, honestly, in early 2020 was the Red Scare girls gave him a way harder time than not the Munk debate, because at the Munk debate, it's one of those things. It's I like more structured debates, like you were saying. I think there's a lot of value in that. I think I absolutely hate the way that streamers do debates where they just keep talking to one and gives up on it, right? It's that seems so stupid to me. And I like opening statements that you can polish in advance, that seems great. But part of my problem with some of that stuff, like the Munk debates or some of the Oxford Union debates, is you'll get these sometimes super vague resolutions or whatever that they're debating, and they just sort of give speeches about them, and they're not really making up. And this one was very much like that, right? It was basically it was an hour and a half or whatever of Steve Bannon throwing vague rhetoric at Froome about salt of the earth working class deplorables that the establishment didn't care about, and David Froome throwing rhetoric back at Steve Bannon, insinuating that he was a fascist. And there was no actual policy discussed, which I thought about it later, and I was yeah, of course, because they're both Republicans, they agree about all that stuff. Right? But then, the Red Scare appearance, give Anna and Dasha credit, 2020 Anna and Dasha, they actually asked, okay, so you're a big, I mean, they were very friendly about it, but there was a point where they were okay, so you're a big populist. What do you think about Medicare for all? He was no, but why not? Right? Why don't you support that? And it was so much more useful.
Yeah, now I'm remembering the Jordan Peterson political correctness debate. I think Jordan Peterson was debating with Stephen Fry, if I remember. Yes. And it went all sorts of places, and I would characterize it exactly in the way that you did, Ben. And I distinctly remember this one moment where Stephen Fry was we've gone way off topic. I had an argument. I had steps, and we're not I'm the comedian and I want order and logic here, but where have we gone, kind of thing.
That's the debate. That's the debate where I think he got called a mean old white man.
Yes.
By was it Michael Dyson something? Eric Dyson or
Michael Eric Dyson.
Yeah. That's it, Michael. Yeah. Yeah.
Which is exactly the kind of thing that always drives me crazy. It's did Jordan Peterson slip him some money before the debate to call him that? Because that is such a like that's what he lives for, right? Is
exactly.
to like have that exact interaction. This is exactly the terrain he wants this to happen on.
Yeah.
Yeah,
to some extent, I think maybe some of that happens here too. We'll see. There's like the resolutions themselves. I mean, maybe we'll get to that later. But the resolution is something like don't trust be it resolved. Don't trust the mainstream media. So like, you can maybe foresee that there might be some problems with that.
Yeah.
Okay,
it seems a little vague.
Yeah, seems very vague, right? So, because you could distrust the mainstream media for a lot of different reasons, right? I mean, like in a lot of different ways, right?
Yeah, you could just research, like still listen to the mainstream media, but maybe do a little fact checking here and then, all the way from that to like just never watching it because you think it's like run by lizards. I mean, there's a broad spectrum of not trusting the media,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you could think that. I mean, yeah, like, and yeah, you could have reasons for it, going from like, the Chomsky-Herman propaganda model to, I think the like globalist Jewish lizard people, make the news anchors say that the Pfizer vaccine works. Like there's a lot of space there, and some of those are more useful than others.
Yeah, it's also like. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Ethan.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think that's I think that sort of that's a funny way of sort of like getting at it, but I think that what that sort of suggests is like it seems like when we're talking about distrusting the media, people who are like on the left have very plausible like mechanistic stories to tell about like why not, and then people on the right, it's just like whatever fits, whatever gets you to the conclusion.
Yeah, I was just going to say there's something about the way the question is put that kind of misses the point for me, because the media is not a monolith and it's also not static. It's sort of an active terrain of struggle with workers and bosses and editors and norms of professionalism, and also public and alternative media that act as countervailing forces. So it's sort of a dynamic and negotiated consent manufacturing factory, but still it is a negotiated one that can be different and is different. So to have it put as a yes no is tough, but
and actually I should say too, one of the reasons I suggested that Gordon join us as well is because like he is a working journalist. He's been like in the mainstream media in Canada, the CBC I think at one point, and some other stuff too. So you'll know your own CB better than me, but
yeah, I would generally describe myself more as an alternative journalist, working in left media, but we've often partnered with larger, more mainstream organizations, including the CBC, many a time. That kind of dried up when we got more overtly leftist, which is a funny story we can talk about. Yeah. But also other sort of major, more normie podcasts. And I've seen the good, and I've also seen the bad. And it's something I study. I study trust in media and trust in science, especially, but how that relates to media. So I've got a bunch of thoughts.
Well,
you were way too left for the communist CBC, eh? Anyway, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, so there are 4 debaters. What we're going to watch, there is, I believe, on the side of, yes, we promise we're not lizard people, trust the mainstream media, are Michelle Goldberg, who's for the New York Times. So it's like if you read Michelle Goldberg, she's like Elizabeth Warren in her politics, right? She's just like a left liberal. And she's like neither the best nor the worst example. That's just fine, right? And Malcolm Gladwell,
Canada's own.
Malcolm Gladwell, yeah.
Canadian content.
I appreciate I got some Canadian Club for the occasion, by the way. Thanks for repping the CanCon.
And then on the don't trust the mainstream media, we've got a really interesting contrast because the 2 people are Matt Taibbi and Douglas Murray. So like Matt Taibbi, like I don't know, I have like complicated feelings about Matt Taibbi because of like different things he's saying, you know, he's written and different, you know, kind of stances he's taken over the course of, you know, the last several years. You know, I used to like him a lot. I still respect certain aspects of what he's doing, even if like I think his priorities are not what I would like anymore. Like he's, I think, very consumed with certain kinds of culture war things.
Yeah.
But I will say, whatever else you could say, good or bad, about Matt Taibbi, you know, which is like a whole discussion in itself, and maybe not a good use of anybody's time to like try to. Okay, at the end of the day, Matt Taibbi, good or bad, right? You know, on some level, who cares? But I will say, one thing I think you do have to give him, at least, you know, my view. I don't know if anybody else has read it or has a view on this, but I actually think his book from 2020, I want to say, Hate Inc. Is like a really excellent bit of media analysis that he wrote it. You know, I mean, Gordon was alluded earlier to Manufacturing Consent, right? The Chomsky and Herman classic. And originally Taibbi was writing Hate Inc. as a sort of, you know, however many decades later it's been, update to Manufacturing Consent, and it still ends with an interview with Chomsky where they talk about the differences and stuff. But he also, I think not entirely incorrectly, decided at a certain point in writing, it's like, no, that the problem with like 2020s media is not the same as the problem with like, I don't know, whatever, 1980s media that Manufacturing Consent is talking about, or at least there are a lot of new problems, even if there's some version of the old ones that's still there underneath. That, like, the kind of media landscape that Chomsky and Herman were writing about was all about, like, I mean, in a way, like the critique was about the limits, how the limits of debate are set, and like what sort of, because of a certain conception of like a consensus mainstream. And what the Taibbi book is all about is how that's broken down because of the economic collapse to, you know, a great extent of a lot of traditional media. And it's and the way that you end up with, like, you know, I don't know, either maybe it's a dated example. I think she might have left or something. I don't pay that much attention, but like Rachel Maddow, you know, talking about like Russia and MSNBC, or like, you know, Tucker Carlson scaring old people about immigrants and Fox. Like either way, like both of them together, there's like a fraction of the number of people watching who are watching like Walter Cronkite talk about Vietnam or whatever. So, and that's really important because they're, you know, they're speaking to, like, you don't have to have this like the sort of veneer of objectivity that Chomsky are criticizing. There's a lot that's accurate, you can say, to criticize that, but it's like a lot of this stuff is just sort of given up on that as even as like.
Looks like we lost Ben there.
Oh, I was afraid it was just me.
No. I think he's got a bit of a bad connection. I was noticing some choppiness.
Maybe he's thinking really hard about how to finish the point.
Well, I've read the book. I'll sort of jump in Ben's stead. I agree. I mean, Hate Inc. is like, I think, a pretty trenchant media critique that is probably not appreciated as much as it should be. I mean, it mostly follows the Chomsky thesis. Like, basically, the Chomsky thesis has this idea of 5 like filters that filter out critical media, and the first 4 are mostly political economic. They're like advertising, concentration, competition type things, and then the 5th one was anti-communism, and then later it was Islamophobia. It's like more of an ideological one, a purely sort of ideological one. And what Taibbi says is like, now it's partisanship, right? Because like the consensus media has disappeared. So what sort of glues together a media ecosystem is like, you hate the other side. And you can kind of see this played out in like the political polarization of readers. Like, you look at, you know, what do people identify as if they watch MSNBC or the New York Times? Like 95% liberal, things like that, which didn't quite exist when Chomsky was writing, because there was more of a sense of it being a consensus document. I was just trying to fill in. Okay.
Fill in there for the but I was going to say that pattern also kind of perfectly matches to some extent the polarization of Congress, right? Because everyone talks about how Congress up until like the 90s was kind of this consensus mechanism, right? And then it became polarized as the media became polarized. I'm not sure which one came first, but I mean, it's probably not a coincidence that like Fox News started in like 97 or something like that, right around the time of like the Gingrich era.
Yeah, but I would say it's mostly a marketing gimmick, because like one of the things that Chomsky talks about is a sort of narrow scope of debate, and I think more or less that still exists, because I can't remember if this comes up in Hate Inc., but like the difficulty of talking about things that are bipartisan, like problems like criminal justice, that because it evades that frame that's conducive to the sort of the partisan media, it just doesn't get covered.
I wonder if the sort of like polarization of the media that's described just has to do with like, you know, back in the day, if you want to consume like news or political content, you have like a few options, like, you know, whatever channels are on TV or like a few journals or whatever. And then like over time, you know, sort of like more and more people became able to sort of like proliferate like their perspective, like with their own radio shows and now their own YouTube channels and stuff. And like slowly more and more people just were able to express their ideas. And so now when people want to consume news or political content, they can find somebody who suits their ideology like exactly. So why would we all watch the neutral ones? Maybe something like that. Yeah.
No, I think that is a lot of what Taibbi is describing in Hate Inc. I mean, that's kind of why. I mean, I think I listened to that this around the same time I started this show, which was also like a really opportune time to start a YouTube show, because it's like, you know, this was like peak pandemic when like even CNN was kind of a YouTube show, right? I mean, like somebody was just, you know, was just kind of doing it from his living room, you know, like it's all sort of felt like the same thing. And like, you know, I mean, there are good and bad things about it, but yeah, I mean, this is like that change that like you have, like it used to be such a clean division, right? There's like mainstream media and alternative media, and alternative media was like literally Xeroxed. Like that's what alternative media was. And it's like, yeah, now it's a much, you know, it's like, you know, there's still a big difference, obviously, like you don't even like super popular alternative shows for the most part, right, are smaller than you know, established networks and stuff by a lot. But like, although, you know, like you also have things like you know, for better or for worse, people might have different feelings about this. Like obviously the Joe Rogan is like a case in point of like, you know, this like crazily super popular thing that's totally outside of any kind of traditional media structure. But yeah, I think what Ethan's talking about is exactly it. That, you know, everybody can. There's so much now, right? That everybody can just kind of curate their own media diet a la carte. You know, that it's like, you know, Fox isn't quite right wing enough for you, no problem, right? We've got, you know, the fuck is it called, OAN or whatever,
Newsmax,
Newsmax, you know. That doesn't get it done, right? No problem. You know? And yeah, if you want to have and you know, even, and people don't like, they don't correct, there's like so much less incentive for a lot of, I mean, I'm sure like CBC or whatever is different, but like, you know, even a lot of like mainstream cable news, there's like so much less incentive to like do corrections and stuff like that, you know, when you get stories wrong, because like, you know, there's like, yeah, when in the fog of war, when like you get to be the first one to break something, there's like a crazy incentive to be the one to break it, and then when it turns out to be wrong, it's like, what, you're gonna let this off your audience by siding with like the people who never thought it was true, just to quietly drop it, right? So like you get this weird stuff like very uncomfortable stuff, like sometimes you know, if you just watch progressive and somewhat mainstream media, like when like the Kyle Rittenhouse trial was going on, you probably had a pretty inaccurate idea of what was going on until the end when the verdict happened, and you were like shocked by it. right? Whereas because that one was convenient for right-wing narratives, if you were watching there, you did know, and of course there's like tons of stuff where it's the, it's not a value judgment, just a factual one, right? We could have a separate argument about whether it's sane to have laws that, to have like, legal structures whereby like cops can see like a, teenager, holding like a, rifle that makes it look like he's on his way to fight the Taliban in Afghanistan. And say, and like on his way into a riot. So I'd be like, all right, keep going, right? Like, as you were. But like, that's, and then like, obviously there's tons of stuff that is in the other direction. You just don't know because like nobody has an incentive to tell you, which is definitely one of the reasons that I think it's a really good, like, this is one of the reasons that I think that doing debates is like one of the best things you can do in media because it's like the only chance you ever get to talk to somebody else's little audience.
And that can have like big consequences as well, like, and I think that's in part what we saw with like the January 6th stuff was like, you have all of these people who were under the impression, given the media they'd watched, that like Trump is supposed to win the election. Right. And so then when it doesn't happen, it's like, wait, that wasn't supposed to happen. There must have been meddling involved. Whereas if they'd been watching, media that was telling them like, well, no, Trump's down in the polls, he's most likely not going to win according to most analysts, then it would have been less of a shock and probably wouldn't have prompted the same reaction.
Sometimes when I talk to students about this kind of thing, like I feel like the kind of filter bubble and media fragmentation case is like overstated, honestly. And I'll tell you why, because I think it's more true for like politically obsessed sickos like us, where we read Jacobin and we think it's a big deal, but like when you compare it to the sort of papers of record, it really doesn't matter all that much. And when you read sort of political economists of media, what you see...
It was nice talking to you, so I'm going to continue with Victor and
Ethan. There's just a lot, actually, in real terms, there's a lot less reporters. So actually, the sort of mainstream outlets have more say over the agenda setting, especially when it comes to actual, like, boots on the ground, shoe leather journalism. Like, what we do, like, frankly, as valuable as it is, it's mostly counter spin on the mainstream narrative. We're not sending Ben to a war zone, right? Because we don't have the left doesn't really have the resources. So while there is this sort of polarization, like on the other direction, I think there's actually more influence from like the people that can fund war reporters and international correspondents and that sort of thing. And for your normally uncle who's not, super involved online, he's seeing an even smaller and more constricted media sphere than he would have when Chomsky wrote Manufacturing Consent.
I don't know. I feel like if we all pitched in, we could probably get him a ticket, Probably won't be too difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess it depends which war. But,
yeah.
Also, one broke out in Mexico. I'm actually real close to an army base, so just go down the hill and might see some stuff. Yeah, no, for sure. I think that's an interesting point. So all this started, right, with just saying, just to circle back to the original point, that Matt Taibbi, whether you like him, dislike him, have very mixed feelings about him, whatever, is like at his best, is like actually an interesting media critic. Mm-hmm. Whereas like Douglas Murray is like, look, highbrow Richard Spencer would probably be unfair. I feel like that'd be an overstatement, but like, because the guy has nothing useful to say.
It's not far off, yeah, and I think not to have any spoilers here, but I think that's going to come through here.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how Douglas Murray's kind of like, intellectually speaking, and in terms of like the content of what he says and like the the quality of his ideas, he's not too far off from like your average, like Steven Crowder or Ben Shapiro. But he sort of has this perception as being like more like sophisticated and highbrow because he like has a British accent and will like name drop Christopher Hitchens every once in a while. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there is a certain style of conservative writing where like my favorite example of this, is there's this guy who writes for the National Review. I assume he still does. I haven't run across any of his stuff in a while. David Hansen, I think is the guy's name.
Oh, yeah.
Who, like, if you read him, he's like, his columns there, he's like constantly working himself into like a lather of outrage over like whatever culture war bullshit happened the last week, and it's like, it's a kind of hyperbolic version of Republican talking points, but the whole thing is that, like, you know, once a column he like throws in a reference to Thucydides or something, you know, to like show he's smart, and like I think there is like a real whole genre of conservative writing that revolves around stuff like that.
Yeah.
And you know, Douglas Murray strikes me as very much in that vein, right? You know,
Yeah.
You know, he's gonna like, it's like the if anybody you know, watched, there was like an early season South Park episode where they did this like parody of Great Expectations, and it started with like this you know, white-haired British guy in a library with leather-bound books behind him, you know, and he comes out at the beginning of the episode and says, "I'm a British person."
Yeah. I was actually just going to say that I feel like Douglas Murray has this like mystique that some Americans find irresistible, this kind of like British mystique that just gives him an aura of this like intelligence that I feel like would really seduce a certain kind of like American conservative, which is like, oh wow, this guy's like a really smart, like, you know. And I think it is just the way he carries himself.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's like the accent, but it's also like not just the accent, you know, because you have, you know, if you listen to like Charles Murray talk and you listen to like, I don't know, someone like Piers Morgan talk,
Douglas Murray.
I don't know, you can kind of tell that Douglas Murray just sound like his mannerisms, like in the way he speaks, he's like, he just sounds sort of like the way the average person would imagine like a sophisticated person sounding, you know?
Yeah, he's like performing posh.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's a funny contrast because Matt Taibbi, I don't know if I would call it a shtick, but he does talk a lot about his like the kind of decline of the working class media and the working class journalist. I don't know that he has an advanced education. He might. I think his dad was a newspaper editor or something along those lines, but he idolizes a very different kind of media sphere. So the critique comes from a very different direction, that like the media is sort of disconnected from working people and concerned with, you know, shallow culture wars. Ironically, Ben, because to your point, Matt Taibbi seems to be going in that direction too. But
I mean, like many people, I think it's easy for there to be this like kind of mission creep that sets in with that, right? That you sort of start out correctly noticing that, you know, people are focused on inconsequential bullshit, and then you like fight with them about it, and then before you know it, like your whole like raison d'etre is like, you know, owning those people.
Yeah.
Like, the best way to do it is by fighting them like on the terrain of exactly that kind of inconsequential bullshit.
Yeah. I think this is the story for a lot of like sort of post-lefty people, where like they started in a decent place, they were somewhat mistreated, and then they became a little hysterical, like maybe rightly at first, but you know, 5 years later, like, what the fuck is going on here?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, look, it's sort of like it's almost like a photo negative of like the way that like you know, it's like the way that like liberals reacted to Donald Trump and like abhorring him for a lot of really good reasons, right? I mean, like Trump was and is abhorrent, you know, but like then it's like, you know, okay, like anti-Trump becomes the beginning and end of your politics, and it's like everything that's like suddenly, it's like everything you were ever committed to can be tossed out the window if like this week's Trump versus anti-Trump narrative demands it, right? So it's like, you know, whatever. It's like, oh, the CIA, I love the CIA now, right? You know? They're awesome. And it's like kind of it's just like that the other way around, you know?
Yeah, like, that's a good analogy.
You know, it's like, yeah, you have, you know, you spend this one will just be about like an unnamed hypothetical character, but like, you know, you have, you know, you spend the Obama years like making enemies with a bunch of liberal media creatures for like really good reasons, because like you're mad at Obama about like drones and detention and stuff like that like you should be very mad at him about, and like they get mad at you for being mad at Obama and etc. And then it's like, you know, somehow 5 years later it's like, and so it's like, yeah, oh, you're 100% of the right about this, but like somehow 5 years later, 10 years later, you're on like, Tucker Carlson talking about, why like whatever the, whatever bullshit Democrats, Republicans are fighting about this week, the Republicans are actually right about it. It's like, wait, how did that happen? it's like you just got too mad at the libs, and it's like, I get it, right? The libs are annoying, but like if owning the libs becomes the beginning and end of your politics, you end up in some really stupid places.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, I guess like sort of, yeah, I think like the lesson to be gleaned from these kinds of people, like you Dave Rubin's and, to some extent, maybe like Matt Taibbi's, or, other people. I don't want to give like a full name, but or full exhaustive list of names, but like, I mean, it just seems to me like it's just people who like got away from focusing on things that on reflection seem to them to be like principled and like important. And instead it's just like, you're getting so fed up with people who are yelling at you that the sort of your main focus becomes opposing the people who are opposing you.
Yeah, you want to own them. And it's like, look, I mean, you can often find ammunition in a given week because it's like those people suck, and like they'll you can find stuff to own them about where you'll be right. But like, also, is this really like, I don't know. I mean, like I'll say, like with the Twitter files. Now, to be fair, I think I'm probably about 500 installments of the Twitter files behind. I haven't like kept up with every new one, right? But like for the first like 5 or 10 or something, I was like paying pretty close attention, and like when it finally got to Li Feng, he was like, okay, I'm gonna get the database. What do I want to look up? Well, I want to look up like the way that they've like censored like Palestinian like stuff, and the way that they'll like the Pentagon will like make censorship requests. It's like, wow, that actually matters, right? And it's like, wow, I wish we'd started here instead of going through like 3 or 4 Twitter files on like Hunter Biden's laptop, on our way to it. Because it's like, I'm not even saying you guys are wrong about that, but it's like, is this really the thing that like gets you hot and bothered?
Yeah, it's like you have like, all of these people who are sort of like left-wing adjacent in terms of their politics, but like all the things they talk about are like, man, libs were so crazy about Russiagate and like that kind of thing. It's like, that was a few years ago. Let's, Totally,
and it's so weird. Like that's because I was talking to Jason Miles about this like a week ago. I remember it's like it's so weird to me, like the like the way that like anti-Russiagators are obsessed with Russiagate, and it's like the only people who still care about it are them and like those diehard libs, right? It's like, look, I was always pretty skeptical about the Russiagate stuff. You can go back and look at my old social media posts from like 2017, 2016. You can see that as a consistent thread. But like, I don't know. I mean, ultimately, it's like what you're saying is, here's some dumb shit that Democrats believe. And it's like, okay, yes, correct. Like, a lot of people believe a lot of dumb shit. I mean, like, why is this the thing that like is like your defining crusade now to show that they're wrong about? And like then like even like 3 years, 4 years later, like after it's all over, you're still like, hey, remember when they were wrong about Russia?
I think like the reflexive opposition to like tech elites, intelligence agencies, and government officials, and the sort of power that they want to wield over our discourse is a healthy one. So there's parts of that I want to nurture, but I think what's missing for a lot of these people, they don't really have a coherent and theoretically consistent theory of like power and political economy. So in lieu of that, your politics becomes a focus on like cultural pathologies. And like, if I wasn't more steeped in leftist thought and I, operate in the world that I do, academia, I could imagine myself becoming one of these crazies because so much of it pisses me off. But I sort of stop myself because I realize that there are more important things. But I think for a lot of these people where really their politics begins and ends at like the discourse online. That discourse has like broken them. There's no first principle to fall back on. It's just the next hypocrisy that they can score points on, and that's it.
Yeah. No, exactly. It's like, you spend like, there are a bunch of different versions of this. People spend all day, every day, like, finding ways that they can call their Twitter enemies on their like small inconsistencies. It's like,
well, it's hard to resist the temptation to get like caught up in this stuff as well. Like, I mean, there are times where it's like, just some like dumb new Twitter discourse pops up. What do we think about, brick gender people? And then I'm like, okay, what do I think about that? I have to have a take so that I can argue with the other people about it. But then I'm like, what am I doing?
What are you talking about?
What even is a brick gender?
I always abstain.
Like, if you just ask, nobody's going to be like, oh man, Ethan never said what he thought about that.
Perhaps he's anti-brick gender. How do we know?
I think, look, feel free to tell me to fuck off when I say this, but like, I have the times that I like your Twitter least are when it seems like there's this way that I think smart people sometimes end up getting caught up using the medium, where it's like, what's like a hot take that I think is objectively correct, but I'm gonna like, but I'm gonna sort of put it in a real provocative way. I'm gonna watch everybody get pissed off about it, and then I'm gonna like defend it. And it's like, I always look at that, I think, what the fuck is the point of this? Why are you doing this, man? Like, you're so much better than that.
No, we were just talking about that.
That sounds like Mouthy Infidel, but not even.
Of course. That's my
that's what I'm saying. That's your Ethan's Twitter. It's like it's like he comes on here and he has such thoughtful things to say, and it's so good. And then it's on Twitter, and it's like, okay, what's some like sexual ethics edge case that like people are going to say about, but I can defend it, right? Because
no, that's fair. That's a fair critique. I'm sort of conscious, but like I'm sort of consciously critical of that like aspect of like my engagement, but it's also something that I just like haven't fully eliminated yet. It's just kind of it's a work in progress.
If you need to be a sponsor, I'll do what I can. Which, speaking of which, actually, so I want to go to the debate, but I do want to plug real quickly. You guys are starting a new podcast, right? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, that is true. I mean, we are. It is a work in progress. We don't actually have a full name for it yet, although we have a couple ideas, and like we can kind of tease it. And Matt McManus is involved as well, so it's actually the three of us plus Matt McManus. And I think it's actually going to deal with kind of edgy academic arguments is like the basic idea. So I guess like looking at
a much better format for it.
Yeah, that'll be my outlet.
Exactly. It's basically looking at like peer-reviewed work. So like I think we kind of want to at least in principle limit ourselves to like not just crazy random arguments that like online people make, but actual work that comes out of academia that has really counterintuitive or controversial like conclusions, right? There's like that guy Kirshner who writes all these crazy articles. He's like a good example where his work's peer-reviewed, but he has articles like why we shouldn't value equality of opportunity, or like how liberalism could justify slavery, like stuff like that. Should be like fun.
Yeah. No, it's like and it's funny too. Actually, the thing we talked about this once before on one of these, I think, or I don't know, bonus episode or something. But the thing about Kirshner is, even though in some ways he's like seems like he's a total academic troll, and he's just gonna like. He's just going to like defend the craziest shit that he can come up with, which, in a sense, there might be some value to, but it's like also like something like, oh my God, really? Like, why are we doing this? Like, but I will say that just he's so committed to it that it's like every once in a while, it's like every fifth one or something. It's like, oh, actually, he has a point about that. That was interesting.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about that one and found some things that we did like out of it. At least I did, and lots that I thought was totally objectionable. But one of the things that I want us to talk about, we're talking about here a little bit, like what's the point of it? Like being a kind of academic edgelord, or an edgelord in general, does it sort of like sharpen the sword, or does it rot the brain? And I think the jury's still out.
Yeah. Well, I think if
Good
it
way of putting
sharpens
it.
the sword, I think it's going to sharpen the sword. Maybe if you're like writing papers or like doing like an hour-long discussion, if it's just sort of the like put it out there. You know? Okay. Odd Douglas. So speaking of Matt McManus, that reminded me on Douglas Murray, because we've been talking about him because he's going to be one of our debaters. We have. So I just want to mention this, that in current affairs, Matt McManus and Nathan Robinson wrote this review of Murray's book, The War on the West, How to Prevail in the Age of Unreason, which if people who are curious after they watch this want to check that out. Like, I know that the title of the review is Taking White Supremacist Talking Points Mainstream, and that might not make it sound super interesting, because it might just sound like, oh, they're just gonna like, you know, spend the whole time calling them racist or whatever, and like, you know, maybe not totally baseless, but like, how interesting is that? But it's but like, if you actually read the review, it's like, it's a lot of fun to read, because they give him a really hard time sort of dropping these like great books references to support his bullshit that he clearly doesn't actually understand, if like, you know, you start like digging into like what he's saying.
Nice. And actually, I'm noticing here HG in the chat is actually just pretty much captured our like right now leading candidate for the title. So good suggestion.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
All right.
It shows our thought process is really unique here, I think.
Exactly.
All right. Let's watch debate. So
it's got to be the longest intro we've done, 48 minutes in before we actually get to the debate.
This may be the longest intro we've ever done on one of these ever. But so.
There's a first time for everything.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Munk debates. Woo! This is our 28th debate in this series. 28 debates. Wow. Many of you, I know, have been with us since that very first debate at the Royal Ontario Museum. And I got to say, coming back from this pandemic, to finally be here at Roy Thomson Hall with a full house, not a single ticket unsold, is a big credit to all of you. So thank you so much for your support for better public debate. We could not do this without you, and I'm so glad to have all these students on our stage tonight. Thank you, guys. You're in for a real treat. And once again, we have an important, meaty debate for us to dig into. It's one that demands our attention. It touches on a lot of the key issues that are roiling our society right now. And it goes to the heart of what the media is in our democracy, the extent to which the media today provides us with the things that we need as citizens to make sometimes the difficult choices that we need to do about how we're governed. This is a debate about power. How do we hold power and the powerful to account, and what's the media's role in this? So I want all of us to think tonight carefully on our debate motion. Be it resolved, do not trust the mainstream media. Provocative. What does this mean? Well, we're going to find out tonight by inviting onto this stage 4 remarkable debaters. And once again, this could not be possible without the charity that has, for the last 28 debates, convened us here at Roy Thomson Hall and other locations across the GTA to have these conversations. So a big thank you to the Munk family and the Peter and Melanie Munk Foundation for hosting us this evening. Thank you, guys, for once again supporting this debate series. So that time has come. Let's get our debaters out here center stage debating our resolution. Be it resolved, don't trust mainstream media. Arguing for the resolution is a veteran journalist, widely published author, Substack sensation, the new publishing platform that's sweeping a lot of media right now. Please give a warm Toronto welcome to Matt Taibbi.
Thank you.
Well, Matt's debating partner tonight comes here directly from the front lines of the Russia-Ukraine war that he was covering for The Spectator magazine, where he is associate editor. He too is an acclaimed author, debater, and media commentator in the United Kingdom and America. Please welcome Douglas Murray. Thank you, Douglas.
Yeah, thanks for doing this.
Well, one great team of debaters deserves another, and here we do not disappoint. Arguing against our motion, don't trust mainstream media, is celebrated New York Times columnist, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, former Munk debater, Michelle Goldberg. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Get up the red button. Michelle's debating partner is a Canadian journalist. Yes, I will claim him as one of our own. A veteran New Yorker staff writer, a podcasting sensation who doesn't love revisionist history, and an internationally acclaimed author. Ladies and gentlemen, Malcolm Gladwell. Thanks, Malcolm. Okay, we're always innovating here and experimenting at the Munk Debates with our polling system. So what we did tonight is we polled all of you before you arrived. You hopefully got an email, or on the way in, you saw your program or the...
Just parenthetically, this drives me crazy. Like I find this so annoying. Like my least favorite thing about these kinds of like sort of Oxford inspired kind of debates, the like audience poll thing, because like it's just such a goofy model of like how persuasion works that like you're gonna I mean, one, almost anything that anybody on, like everybody who says they're undecided at the beginning is just lying, and like everybody has opinions, and then like nobody, like that's just not how persuasion works. Like what, the next minute, like
yeah. I don't even need to reflect more on what was said here. I'm convinced. I was actually going to ask you about that, like, because I had this thought when I watched the debates that I watched both your debate and Richard Wolff's debate with what's his name? Gene Epstein. And at the end, the margins, I was just like, there's no way. Like, there's no way this is like not somehow or another like rigged by the audience or something. Like, it was just unbelievable. I was going to ask you if you agreed that it was probably not legit.
Yeah, I do. I mean, like, I think a lot of people just like say they're undecided. I don't know whether in their heads they're being dishonest or they're just like, you know, like, well, I'll hear what the communist has to say.
I could, in theory, be convinced. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, like I have a counter take. I actually kind of like it. I'll tell you why, because I feel like it's all a spectacle. Like we talked about how they don't really make coherent, like orderly comments. They don't take it piece by piece. I mean, who is being like, this is just turning our political discourse into sports, and sports can be fun. I have no truck against them. So, and I think you may eat your words when you see the way that the vote shifts, Ben.
Yeah.
Not to spoil things.
I think it's kind of like people want debate to be like an MMA match where there's like a clear winner at the end. Yeah. So it's, and if there's not, they just leave unsatisfied,
Because it's like, look, you could obviously do well or badly in a debate in terms of rhetoric, and you could like objectively do a good job of like presenting a clear argument and responding to everything your opponent has said or not. these things could go together or not. But like also just like in terms of actual persuasion, like, you know, I don't know. I mean, maybe certainly every time I can think of in my life that I've ever like changed my mind about something important, you know, it wasn't like somebody said something and then like I was just immediately like, oh fuck, they're right. It's always a process, right? That you know, it's like, yeah, you like maybe hear a good argument for something you don't like the first time and you're just kind of annoyed by it, but then like it kind of like nags at you. It's like, oh, that was a good point, wasn't it? And like, you know, maybe if you're at just the right point of your arc that like you're kind of ready to hear it, like, you know, something will have more of an impact or whatever. But I don't know. I mean, like there are a lot of things I guess those polls can be responded to, and maybe Gordon's right. That it's just like, you know, like especially with something like this where people are just kind of giving speeches to a certain extent, like, okay, maybe why not? Like maybe you should do it that way. But like it's just the idea that this is going to be some kind of test of like how persuasive what somebody says seems really weird to me.
At least it's not. Do you remember? I think it was CNN when they broadcast political debates. They used to have those tickers at the bottom that would track the sort of audience feedback when someone made a point, and it was real time.
Those were so weird.
Awesome. Yeah. No, exactly. And I think Jeremy in the chat, I think is exactly right. You know, people want the climax of the courtroom confession of Harry Mason episode.
Someone else in the chat mentioned something about why are there weird captive children behind them? I thought that was pretty funny. It is kind of a weird backdrop.
Those were, I actually know that I have an answer to that. It was like some initiative. So it was like a bunch of students. In fact, the reason I went was because as a member of the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto, we had like a coupon code that let us go for like $10. It's normally it's normally like $60 or $70 to just go general admission.
Oh my God.
But my girlfriend and I were just like, sweet, $10, let's do it.
You know, you could go to like 2 Jays games for that price.
Did either you or your girlfriend have your minds changed instantaneously at any point in the debate?
No, I can't say that. I can't say that we did.
I see.
I can't say that we did. I feel like Ben may be in deep in thought once again. Actually, kind of funny. Like when we're waiting for him to come back, when we were like kind of up in one of the balconies during this debate, and there was like this weird woman in front of us, and her and I were just like chatting and reacting to the debate, and I would kind of just like whisper and say something about like what a stupid point that was, and then she would say something, and this woman in front of us would just only turn around when my girlfriend said something, and would just like give us this sneer. And then like I would said we would do tests, and then I would try talking, and she would just, and then she wouldn't react. And then my girlfriend would talk, and this woman would turn around and give us this sneer. It was like, yeah, it was crazy.
Maybe she liked your commentary better.
Yeah, maybe.
All right, I keep getting kicked off Wi-Fi. They can tell the truth about the lizard people, but.
Yes, Joshua, I will
tonight. Do not trust mainstream media.
Get back away from the mic.
Let's get those results up on the screen to give us a sense of where public opinion is in this hall right now. We have a divided debate, 48 to 52. So an audience that is hanging in the balance here, hinged on this resolution, impaled on the horns of a dilemma. I love it. What we're going to do is open up a second question for you now, because we want to know, are you open to changing your mind over the course of what you're going to hear in the next 90 minutes? Can you be persuaded to move from the pro camp into the con camp or vice versa? So to take part in that poll, if you haven't already logged on, simply text message the word Munk, M-U-N-K, not M-O-N-K, to 37607. So I'll give people a moment to do that. Again, to text the word Munk to 37607, and you'll get the question sent to your phone by text message for you to reply to. And as we tabulate those results, I just want to remind our debaters in the audience about our countdown clock, because this is a critical way that we're going to keep this debate on time and our debaters on their toes. So for each of the sections of the debate, you'll see a clock that will appear on the screen for the final moments of that presenter's section. I ask that you start applauding when the clock hits 0, Okay, let's be a little bit generous here. Wait till the clock counts down to 0 and then give them a loud round of applause, and that will move us through our evening. So let's see if we've got some results now from our second audience vote on how many of you would change your mind depending on what you hear tonight. So we'll see if we can get those results up on the big screen. Give them a moment here. If not, right now, we'll bring them to you as soon as they are available. There you are, 82%. Could change your
Bullshit.
mind, 18%. You're committed. Let's see just how committed you are, but this debate is very much in play. So I appreciate everyone voting. And again, we'll have a running poll throughout the evening. So keep an eye for text prompts and results.
I do applaud the
on
honesty of the no
monitors at the
voters, though.
front of the page.
Same. I appreciate it.
Okay, let's go to opening statements. The debaters in advance have agreed on the speaking order, and it gives me great pleasure to ask Matt Taibbi to kick off our debate with our opening statement. Matt, over to you.
Thank you, Roger. Be it resolved, don't trust mainstream media. My name is Matt Taibbi. I've been a reporter for 30 years, and I argue for the resolution. You should not trust mainstream media. I grew up in the press. My father was a reporter. My stepmother was a reporter. My godparents were reporters. Basically, every adult I knew growing up was a reporter. So I actually love the news business, but I mourn for it. It's destroyed itself by getting away from its basic function, which is just to tell us what's happening. My father had a saying, "The story's the boss." In the American context, this means that if the facts tell you the Republicans were the villains in a political disaster, then you write it that way. If the facts point more to the Democrats, you write that. If they're both culpable, as was often the case for me when I investigated Wall Street for almost 10 years after the 2000, you write the story that way. We're not supposed to thumb the scale. Our job is just to call things as we see them and leave the rest up to you. But we don't do that now. The story is no longer the boss. Instead, we sell narrative in a dysfunctional new business model. Once the commercial strategy of the news business was to go for the whole audience. A TV news broadcast was aired at dinner time, and it was designed to be watched by the entire family. Everyone from your crazy right-wing uncle to the sulking lefty teenager in the corner. This system had flaws, but making an effort to talk to everybody had benefits. For one thing, it inspired trust. Gallup polls twice showed Walter Cronkite to be the most trusted person in all of America. That would never happen with a newsreader today. With the arrival of the internet, some outlets found that instead of going after the whole audience, it made more financial sense to pick one demographic and try to dominate it. How do you do that? That's easy. You just pick an audience and feed it news you know they'll like. Instead of starting with a story and following the facts, you start with what pleases your audience and work backward to the story. This process started with Fox, but really now everybody does it. From CNN to OAN to the Washington Post, nearly all media organizations are in the same demographic hunting business. According to a Pew Center survey from a few years ago, 93% of Fox's audience votes Republican. In an exactly mirroring phenomenon, 95% of the MSNBC audience votes Democratic. The New York Times readers are 91% Democrats. Left or right, most commercial audiences in America, anyway, are politically homogenous. This bifurcated system is fundamentally untrustworthy. When you decide in advance to forego half of your potential audience to cater to the other half, you're choosing in advance which facts to emphasize and which to downplay, based on considerations other than truth or newsworthiness. This is not journalism. This is political entertainment, and it's therefore fundamentally unreliable. With editors now more concerned with retaining audience than getting things right, lots of guardrails have been thrown out. Silent edits have become common. Serious accusations are made without calling people for comment. Reporters get too cozy with politicians and report things either without attribution or source to unnamed people familiar with the matter. Like scientists, journalists should be able to reproduce each other's work in the lab. With too many anonymous sources, this is impossible. We just get a lot of stuff wrong now. In the Trump years, an extraordinary number of quote unquote bombshells went sideways. From the P-tape to the Alpha server story to speculation of Russian spy recruited before disco started to false reports of Russians hacking a Vermont utility, we've accumulated piles of these wrong stories. Now, I'm no fan of Donald Trump. I wrote a book about the guy called Insane Clown President. But these stories offend me. A good journalist should always be ashamed of error, and it bothers me to see so many of my colleagues not ashamed. News media shouldn't have a side. It should focus on getting things right, which, believe me, is a hard enough job. Until we get back to the basics, we don't deserve to be trusted, and we won't be. Thank you very much.
All right. Initial thoughts about Taibbi.
I mean, he's kind of laying out the argument that we were discussing earlier when we were discussing his book, about the media or hating or whatever. So, I mean, I think he's making like similar points that I'm sympathetic to.
Yeah, I thought that, everything he said, I thought was basically true. And I agree with that, media has become more sort of like partisan, and that, it's become less trustworthy and less sort of objective. And now people are more like trying to placate certain parts of the political spectrum, which leads to like less accurate coverage and so on. I guess what kind of, bothers me like on a technical level is I only know how to like assess the arguments relative to the conclusion they're supposed to establish. And again, the proposition of this debate seems like sort of vague. And I really didn't like how, the guy who was introducing it was like, we shouldn't, whether we should or shouldn't trust the media. What does this mean? Let's find out from the people who are supposed to be adjudicating the claim. It's like, well, okay, that was a little strange.
I think he's sort of at his best here. I mean, a lot of what he said resonates. Like you said, Victor. I mean, he was talking about things we were talking about. He's fundamentally talking about sort of commodification and democratization, that media is about selling a product to a particular demographic, which I think we sort of can't deny. I think where it falls apart a little bit for me is that what he's looking back to is like a false sense of balance and objectivity. And I don't necessarily think that in particular is the problem. I don't think like having a set of values is a problem. You could say, okay, well, maybe the media should be organized around a different sort of set of public values, for instance, which wouldn't end in what he just said, where it's just like, call the shots like you see them, which is a really kind of naive epistemology for a journalist to have, because there's this sort of reckoning of understanding your positionality and your influences and your class background and the market forces that are driving the imperatives of your profession and your newsroom. And despite him seeming to have a really keen critique of them, he then just falls back on like a 1950s version of media, which is strange to me.
Yeah, what Gordon is saying captures the part of this that I didn't like. Because you're right. I mean, I agree with what everybody's saying. That's like there's a sort of, in broad strokes, into the story that he's telling about some of what's wrong with contemporary media is just right. I mean, this is all the stuff we were talking about earlier. The sort of, the bad incentives that that let people believe incredibly inaccurate things within bubbles. Even putting a little asterisk there for Gordon's actually very well taken point earlier that the people who are the most bubbled are the minority of weirdos who care the most about politics. But that's all broadly right. But like what bothered me is when he's describing his ideal of how he thinks media should work, and how it sounds like he thinks that it used to work, which is Jeremy says in the chat, right? CBS News during the Vietnam War wasn't exactly an unbiased source. Like,
Totally.
It's like, and when you say, so it's like, so there, I guess the two levels on which that bothers me are, like it sort of bothers the leftist in me for the reason that Jeremy kind of said that, you're saying, Gordon, like it's that it's like, come on, man, like, I mean, you clearly really loved Manufacturing Consent, right? I mean, you're originally going to write that book as a sequel to it. Like, how bad media was, before the era that you're complaining about. But it also just, I don't know, I guess it just bothers the analytic philosopher in me because it's like, it sounds like there's a lot of, when he talks about letting the story be the boss, if that's just a way of saying being accurate, fine, sure, that's a good ideal to strive for. But it's like, but the way he further says, like, well, if the facts make the Democrats the villains, or the facts make the Republicans the villains, and it's like, that just kind of makes me want to scream, because it's like, what are you talking about, right? Like, there's some really weird fact value slippage going on here.
Yeah, I mean, it's also like, it's like the story is the boss, but there are a million stories. How are you supposed to decide which one to tell if not some value sort of consideration? Like, this one seems important and consequential, given, my values, or at least broadly shared values, or something like that.
Totally.
Yeah, but like, what I really want to hear from, like, one of them is just, I mean, in terms of you should distrust the media, like, what does that really mean in terms of how we approach the media? Does that mean that anytime we hear CNN say something, we should assume it's more likely false than true? Does it mean we should maybe think like, okay, well, is this a little bit out of context? Like, I guess it's just really vague. Like, there are so many different levels of like distrust or caution.
Mean that like you should think that like there are criticisms of mainstream media that are true, or does it mean like, you literally shouldn't use mainstream media to find out what's happening?
Exactly.
Or worse, does it mean like you should go watch Tim Pool instead?
yeah, exactly. But yeah, like so yeah. I mean, I think there are two problems about the let this story be the boss thing. Like, one, you're right, Ethan. It's the like which story. I think that's a great point. But like then there's also the other problem, which is, even if we're even relative to a given story, like, so like we've decided which piece of information, are relevant to us. Like, okay, but that's still like, I don't know, maybe this is just kind of a, like, maybe this is just like not really the main point he's making. It doesn't matter or whatever, but it's like, well, who's the villains and who's the heroes? I mean, you literally can't derive that from the facts alone, right? I mean, like, there's some sort of background values that, like that sure can combine with facts to tell you that, but it just seems very, so maybe that's like just too much of a hobby horse for me, but like it just seems unhelpful to just conflate those things and be like just like the facts that I am reporting as a journalist, are just enough for you to decide how you should morally or politically feel about this.
What I will say, though, I've been reading a lot about explainer journalism recently because I hate explainer journalism. And I think this sort of points to Matt Taibbi's point that I think is actually kind of onto something. In journalism studies, there's this kind of idea of an explanatory turn, which sort of predates Vox in a lot of places. And people that do sort of content analysis of papers 50, 60 years ago see that the stories are much more particular and grounded about specific people and places. The journalism, like to the point I was making earlier about Matt Taibbi being almost like a working class journalist, it almost has that flavor because it's a less credentialized enterprise. And it is, in fact, much more about just sort of calling it as you see it. And there's all sorts of problems with that because, one fact, even reported sort of faithfully, like, how do we make sense of it, obviously? But the critique on the explainer journalism, and I think Matt Taibbi would make this point too, is then when you move away from those sets of facts, it becomes a set of narratives that is based on like credentialized expertise, reports, statistics that are like sort of made within an official context. And so I think what you have now is a lot of journalists that basically are like quick social scientists, like, sort of
Yeah.
non-credentialized social scientists making claims about, their supposed truths about the world. And I think that actually does create a lot of resentment and mistrust in the public, because you look at the polling, they don't want that. They actually do want like a well-told story about their place, about where they live, for instance. And I think that you see a lot less of that. And I think he does speak to that in a little bit.
Fair enough. Well, maybe we should keep going.
Well done, Matt. 39 seconds on the clock, so you were saved from the dreaded applause. But we appreciate that opening statement. Now we're going to hear from the con side. Michelle, you're up.
Hi there. Thank you for being here. So I'm going to try not to make this argument too America-centric, which I know can happen with American journalists. But I do want to start by talking about an election that we just had in America, and some of the things that the media got wrong in the run-up to that election. There was an article on CNN, why the midterms are going to be great for Donald Trump. Politico commissioned a poll. The poll came back showing that more people intended to vote for Democrats than Republicans. Politico then wrote a story about how Democrats were about to get trounced and dismissed its own poll as an outlier. I bought into the red wave narrative because because it was what the pollsters were saying. It seemed to be what the people who I thought knew what they were doing were saying. So I'm not standing up here and arguing that the media never gets anything wrong, and that the media is full of human beings who are subject to all of the frailties that human beings are subject to, right? The media can be subject to groupthink, it can be subject to fads, absolutely. What I want to argue is that the media doesn't get things wrong because of ideological capture. It certainly didn't help the Democrats when the New York Times was reporting again and again that that Republicans were going to sweep. And in fact, it affected people's donation decisions. It affected their volunteering decisions. A lot of people would have allocated a lot of resources differently if they had any idea that some of these races would be as close as they were. The media tends to overcorrect. It tends to respond to the mistakes that it made. And this can result in new mistakes, but it also means that it is a mechanism that is inherently self-correcting. I think that when you say, can we trust the mainstream media? Obviously, you should seek out lots of sources, right? People should read Matt's blog, they should read conservative media, they should read liberal media. But think about the big stories of the last 5 years or so, from the Trump presidency to COVID to the war in Ukraine. Now, if you had just followed the CBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the BBC, they all got some things wrong. I think a lot of the media didn't pay enough attention, for example, to the problems of quote unquote, I say this as someone with young children, remote learning. I think we got a lot of things wrong during COVID. But in terms of the big stories, if you paid attention to the mainstream media, you were likely to be much safer and much closer to the truth than if you followed the kind of contrarians, if you followed the people who were saying, don't trust the mainstream media, trust these alternative sources of information. If you were saying that, for example, it was a common refrain, I think one that Matt made again and again throughout the Trump presidency, that people who were extremely alarmed about the prospects of authoritarianism, that people who believed that Donald Trump would try to overturn our constitutional order were hysterical. I think that the point of view of the hysterics is actually held up kind of well in light of January 6th. COVID, we got things, the journalists were following experts who were facing a once in a century pandemic, and official guidance kept changing. So you heard different things about masks. You heard different things about whether or not the vaccines really prevented transmission. You heard different things about whether the J&J vaccine was as good as the mRNA vaccines. However, if you followed the mainstream media, you knew that COVID, pretty early, you knew that COVID was airborne. You knew that it was more serious than the flu, and you knew that the vaccines were likely to protect you. The COVID contrarians, the contrarian media, the one who were saying not to trust kind of mainstream sources of opinion, were saying this is just another flu. Deaths are going to be 6,000. The media doesn't want to tell you. I mean, Matt wrote this several times. The media doesn't want to tell you about ivermectin. Similarly, with Ukraine, there was in the run up to the invasion of Ukraine. Again, I think Matt said that the media is overhyping this, that people are kind of taking stenography from the Biden administration that Russia actually is probably not going to invade. And then when it did invade, what you've heard from a lot of kind of people who reflexively distrust the media is that the media is being too triumphalist. They won't admit that Russia's doing much better than they say. They pretending that that the Ukrainians have more of a chance than they did. And again, I would just say that I think that the mainstream media has gotten the big things right. And so while mainstream journalism, there's a lot you can say against it. I would, just to paraphrase Churchill, it is the worst system in the world except for all the others. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Michelle, for that terrific.
Oh, you're muted, Ben.
Matt. Ben. No, I said Matt.
All I was trying to say is what do you guys think?
I thought she was sort of when she says like, well, the mainstream media has some problems, but it's better than the alternative media. It's like, what alternative media? Like InfoWars or like Democracy Now? Like there's a very big difference,
Yes.
Like I feel like she's using alternative media as like sort of this homogenous concept. Like I don't think most like left-wing, I don't think like Democracy Now or like Jacobin or like Current Affairs was saying, COVID's not a big deal, or any of that other stuff that she's like ascribing to the alternative media. So I guess it was a bit weird for her to use the word in such an overly broad way.
Yeah, right. Because it's like you should trust, because she sort of used this category of like contrarians, and it's like, well, I mean, sometimes she just kind of seemed to be Matt Taibbi, but also not all of that stuff is even true about Taibbi. I mean, he didn't, Matt Taibbi doesn't like, I don't know. I mean, unless I really missed like a culture war memo, I don't think he was ever talking about ivermectin.
I thought she started by saying the media is inherently self-correcting, and I have no idea what she's talking about. Do journalists do like replications? Like there's not a lot of media criticism, and I think it's just the opposite, that like media narratives and media sort of facts are hardening when they keep being repeated, and it's very difficult for us to shake them. And someone in the chat said, has she ever read a newspaper? And I think that's a good point, because she hasn't read her own for some very big things that they got wrong, like the Iraq War, the financial crisis. And yeah, some of the things about COVID, they sort of got right. But that's a pretty low bar to say, like, we talked to some scientists and we did stenography to tell you what the like scientific consensus is. Like, okay, I guess that's like valuable communications, but that's not like sort of holding people to account and doing like really meaningful investigations about who is COVID affecting and why, and what is the policy response. And I'm sure they did some of that, but they also get a lot wrong. And the notion that it's self-correcting, it feels like you need more to make that claim.
I sort of got the sense that what she meant by self-corrected is that, like, at least judging by her initial example about the midterms, was something like, when everybody in the media is like really attached to some narrative or that like predicts that something will happen, that it does happen, then like people like, then people like switch to a new narrative or something, which it's like, at least that's what, again, maybe it was just poorly laid out, but it's like, because she started talking about how everybody was saying that the midterms would be a disaster for the Democrats, there's going to be a red wave. And like, that's the kind of thing. It's a weird example too, because it's like so many other examples weren't even about like whether you were being accurate about what was happening. It was like whether your guess was right about something that would happen in the future. It's like, is that even what you go to the media for? Like, because it's like nobody like, dude, does anybody think that journalists have some like special power to like to like figure out like what Vladimir Putin is going to decide to do in the future?
Yeah. I also think like, so sort of some of what she said was like, okay, sometimes the media messes up, but it's not because of all these other things. It's because of, you know, this one thing, like this process of overcorrection or whatever. But it's like, I mean, I guess, that's I guess that's like a claim you could make, but I mean, it seems like there are other plausible mechanisms that it's weird to just like hand wave by saying, no, this is the only mechanism. And she didn't really provide any reason to think that that was the only mechanism and that all the other plausible mechanisms, like the ones offered by like Chomsky and Herman or the ones offered by Matt Taibbi, are just totally inapplicable. Like there's just no reason to take that away from anything she said, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I sort of felt that like her bigger point was sort of how I felt, which is just like, if not the mainstream media, then who? And this kind of goes back to something Gordon was saying before. It's like, what other organization actually has boots on the ground and like is doing like reporting? And it's like, sure, I don't know if maybe I'm wrong, but Democracy Now!, I mean, do they have like reporters that go on the ground and investigate things? Maybe they do for some things, but they're probably relying on stories that the mainstream media is actually like going and getting. And I just feel like I think her overall point, in my opinion, is correct, which is like, you know, what else are you going to rely on? Like, I guess to me, the implication of just saying like we shouldn't trust the mainstream media in this kind of robust way is kind of just maybe going down the path towards a kind of radical skepticism. It's just like, okay, well, I'm going to be like skeptical of everything. Like, yes, of course, there's a lot of problems with the mainstream media, and like it could be better, but I still feel somewhat sympathetic to just that overall point.
Yeah,
that it's just no one else is doing that work.
Yeah, doesn't that kind of go back to what Ethan was saying earlier, though, about like how vague the proposition is? You know,
Yeah.
like because again, like two ways that you could not trust the mainstream media are like thinking that like one would just be like pointing out all these flaws in how mainstream media work that are often going to be true, right? And then the other one is saying that like you literally like should not use this as your mechanism on a day-to-day basis for like finding out which events are happening in the world. And it's like, I agree. The second one is like probably an impossible standard because like, you know, even if in some sense they don't deserve it, it's like, yeah, I totally agree. It's like literally, right? What's the alternative? Like, it's not just going to be people who are reading things that were originally going to, you know, produced by the mainstream organizations and then like, you know, trumpeting the ones that they like or, you know, or giving their own spin on it or whatever. It's like, I think that's largely fair. Like, I mean, sometimes, you know, there are exceptions. Like there are certainly news stories that are like broken by, you know, like, and these are fuzzy categories anyway, but like I think we'd say alternative, you know, media sources, like, you know, like The Intercept is an obvious case of like of you know, of an alternative kind of media source that actually does like break original news information of their own. But yeah, I mean, I also think like if you limited yourself to only reading The Intercept and you also were only limiting yourself to reading Intercept articles that were like taking cues from things that were, you know, reported elsewhere, there's just a lot of stuff you wouldn't know about because they just don't have the resources to cover it the same way.
Yeah, and I think that like one sort of thought that's potentially relevant here is like, I think that in terms of media distorting of the truth, I don't think that the media very often just straight up like lies. Like, I don't think that the media usually just like makes up things or just says things that are just like straightforwardly not true. I think that usually the way the media will distort the truth when they do it is more through like what they choose to emphasize, or like what context they tend to like put the facts in, and like what sort of takeaways they give from that, and so on. And so I think, like, you know, the point of maybe listening to, like, you know, Democracy Now! Or other alternative news sites is that, like, even though they're sort of getting the basic facts that are sort of gathered by the reporting of places like CNN, and I think that we can take it that those facts are probably reliable, but then they're putting the facts in like a different context and giving like a different perspective on it, and maybe in a context that's more sort of like truth tracking, or like accurate than the context that CNN would give for like the same reporting, I guess.
I mean, I think the place where there's a blurry line about that distinction, like, are you sort of just straight up saying stuff that's not true, right? Or are you all that other stuff you just said? Are you giving like a distorted interpretation of it, or, you know, or like not putting things in context that would be more informative or whatever? Like, I think where the line gets blurry, like, and some of the examples Gordon mentioned earlier, right, like the Iraq War, go to this, are that like government sources really do just straight up make shit up, and like mainstream media will often just like report the fact that they said it in a way that's like, okay, you're not exactly saying this is true, but like clearly any normal reader is meant to like read this and think, oh, I guess that's true. Like, you know, the multiple high-level intelligence sources, say blah blah blah, and some total bullshit made up, like it's like, okay, the New York Times didn't exactly say that the thing was true. All they technically said was multiple high-level intelligence sources said it, but like in practice, they're at least, oftentimes without any kind of like real journalism going on at all, right? Any attempt to like check to see whether it's true. They're just relaying the falsehood. And yeah, I do also just want to like really like underline and circle like part of what Gordon just said, because it's like one of the things that really bothered me about the Michelle Goldberg thing. It's like, okay, she's got this category of contrarians, and I think Ethan's right that like it's a very poorly defined category. Like, who are we talking about here? Like, you sort of feel like right? Like it's also like, I think what she's really talking about is like, oh, people who go on Joe Rogan or something like that, right?
Yeah, like Brett Weinstein, and Tim Pool and all those people.
Yeah.
Well, and she also seems to conflate that category with the category of alternative media, which I think is also unhelpful.
Yeah.
Totally, right. She's equated like it's like, I think she's like, when she says contrarians, you feel like you know what she means, but then you actually stop and think about it. And it's like, okay, is this Matt Taibbi? Is this Alex Jones? Like who are we talking about here, right? Is this Tim Pool, right? Because those three are all really different from each other. But it's also, but like to Gordon's first point, right? When we first started talking about this, like, okay, but it's like, if you're just going to say, here are some like predictions that, contrarians made that turned out not to be true. What about all the stuff that mainstream journalists have predicted, or worse yet, said was true in the present tense that turned out not to be true, right? I mean, like again, I don't think it's the most important story in the history of the universe or whatever, but it's like, it's like actually the Hunter Biden laptop stuff, like saying or relayed people saying that it was like Russian disinformation. Actually, it was pretty bad, right? Like that's like a pretty big L. And and then you have like vastly more important things like the Iraq War, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's like the only example she gives of mainstream journalists getting something wrong is that they didn't realize that the Democrats would do better in the midterms. And it's just like, it's also, it's like, okay, that's, I don't know. It seems like she's just cherry picking like crazy here. I don't even know what the conclusion is, except for like, me and my friends at the New York Times are good, and like Matt Taibbi and his buddies about.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's a big, I guess, like methodological problem I have in general with this kind of debate is like, both sides so far, and I imagine the trend is going to continue, both sides kind of come up and will give some examples of things the media got right or wrong. And it's like, well, coming into this debate, I had no doubt in my mind that both sides could take a bunch of examples enough to fill a 6-minute opening statement. But like that doesn't constitute like some sort of comprehensive analysis of like, okay, what proportion of the time is the media getting stuff right versus wrong or something like that.
And you need some sort of selection criteria, like who is the alternative journalist and what is a proper case and how did you decide? A
much larger sample size as well.
Yeah.
Let's keep going.
Perfect opening statement. We're now going to turn it over to Douglas for the next pro opening statement. Douglas, the stage is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Rudyard. Thank you.
I already agree.
To be here, as Rudyard said, I've come a rather long way from the front lines of the Ukraine conflict because I like to see these things with my own eyes for myself and to come to my own conclusions. I came out through Moldova the other day, through London, then got to Toronto, and a friend of mine said, "Why are you going to Toronto?" I said, "An invitation to Toronto in late November, who on earth says no to that?" Only a madman would say no to that. You'll see shortly why I'm so keen to speak about this issue here in Canada. Let me put it this way, though, to begin with. I would say in recent years, any sentient observer of the media will have had their moment of realization, a moment where they saw through something that the mainstream media was doing. It may have happened because the mainstream media said something about you or someone you know. It may be, as in my case, for instance, that an entire country got maligned by the mainstream media. It's very interesting, this result. It was a 48-52. That's exactly the result the British people had in the Brexit vote. You know what? When we voted to leave the European Union, we did so against all of the implications of the New York Times, Michelle's employer. We just didn't listen to them. And the New York Times never forgave us. Ever since 2016, there has not been one story in the New York Times that's positive about Britain. We have had, and I'll run through some of them, we had a culinary review.
I just want to pause for half a second to say there is a 0% chance that's true. The New York Times has never said anything positive about Britain in the last however many years. Okay.
That said that the British people still survive on mutton and oatmeal. We had an anti-Brexit piece from the north of England, from Lancashire, a piece of reporting, where the author ended up having to admit that every single one of his facts was wrong, but his perception was correct. We had recently the New York Times drafted in somebody from Russia Today, Vladimir Putin's propaganda channel, as an employee of the New York Times to attack Brexit Britain. And when Her Majesty the Queen died, not 10 days of mourning was observed at the New York Times, 3 hours before they started attacking the Queen. And they did so day after day after day because they hate Brexit Britain.
As it should be.
That is just an agenda, ladies and gentlemen. That's not anything else. That's an agenda, one they've decided to take. Now, I said that I want to be here in Canada to talk about this because I think that this country has just been through something absolutely extraordinary. You really know that the world is in trouble when Canada becomes very interesting. I remember when your elections, as Norm MacDonald said, were all about, like, should we put up that bridge or not? Now Canada has become really interesting. It became interesting in January and February of this year. Why? Because you had
No, we're still not.
In Ottawa. Really interesting. When people come out in large numbers, and you know what the job of reporters is? The job of reporters is to go out and say, why are you on the streets? What brought you here? Why are you here with your kids? Why have you got a bouncy castle in the middle of Ottawa? That's a bit strange. Ask them questions. Just find out the story. But you know what? The government didn't want that in Canada. Your Prime Minister decided in advance that these people were, oh, what did he do? All the modern excommunications. They were Nazis, they were white supremacists, they were anti-Semites, they were probably homophobes, they were misogynists, they were probably transphobes, etc., etc., etc. He did all the things you do in the modern political age if you want to just defenestrate somebody who's awkward to you. And then he brings in the Emergency Powers Act. Now, at such a time, what would the mainstream media do? It would question it. It would question it. The Canadian mainstream media did not. The Canadian mainstream media acted as an amen chorus of the Canadian government. I will give you a couple of examples, but ladies and gentlemen, I could go on for hours with examples of this. You had a CBC host describing the Freedom Convoy as a, quote, feral mob. You had a Toronto Star columnist saying, quote, sorry for the language, it's a homegrown hate farm that was then jet-fueled by an American right-funded rat-fucking operation. They can't even write at these papers anymore. CBC said that 2 Indigenous women were so scared to go outside in Ottawa because of racist violence, didn't bother to mention that Indigenous drummers had led the truckers in an O Canada rendition. The National Observer said that the many Black and Indigenous Freedom Convoy supporters were in fact duped by the truckers. The Globe and Mail reporter said, my 13-year-old son told me to tell protesters I'm not a Jew out of fear of anti-Semitic violence, without mentioning that one of the leaders of the convoy was himself Jewish. Now, why is this so rancid? Utterly, utterly rancid and corrupt. Because in this country, your media, your mainstream media, is funded by the government. A totally corrupted system. In 2018, election year, coincidence, the Canadian media has given $595 million over 5 years. The Toronto Star estimated it was going to be getting $3 million from the government in the first half of the year. It went on and on. So you see, the mainstream, the government in Canada can tell people they can tell the banks to shut down people's bank accounts. Oh yeah, your government can do that. And if you're happy with that, just think about what would happen if the shoe was on the other foot. The government can do that. But in Canada, they can also tell the media what to do. And the media does the bidding of the Canadian government. That isn't a free society's media. I've seen free countries all my life. But this, in a developed liberal democracy like Canada, is a disgrace. We're not saying don't read the mainstream media. We're just saying don't trust them.
Thank you, Douglas. Okay, Malcolm.
All right.
That was
for this one. I'll practice progressive stack and go to the Canadians first.
Yeah, that was. I mean, yeah, I'm remembering. I'm being triggered again. I feel like by how, like, what a sophist he just is. Like all the little things he's throwing in. Like he offered, like, I don't know, Gordon, maybe you can speak to this more, but I don't think that there's any evidence that the CBC, that like the government is telling the CBC what to report on. Like, I don't think that's ever happened. It's like a clearly arm's length organization. And I love how he just like threw it in several times. He's like, oh, it's an election year. And I mean, I don't think there's any evidence for that. It's just like complete nonsense.
No, I mean,
yeah,
it's CTV Global, the Toronto Star, all these places essentially did the same coverage. It's not the problems that he's pointing to, which, you know, I don't want to, totally poo-poo it, because I think there's an element of truth to this. Like, most journalists really did hate the truckers, and there's a lot of problems with that movement, and there's a lot of shifty people and shifty funding. But when you actually like sort of walk past them, like maybe you see one sort of Confederate flag here or there, but for the most part, they're just kind of normal people wrapped up into something. I mean, what the genesis of the movement is, we can sort of talk about that, but I think the sort of active disdain was a problem. I think that's a general thing, though. Like, journalists generally hate their public. They always say, like, don't read the comments. I've been watching Veep lately, and every time Selena Meyer hangs out with her constituency, she says, it's time to normalize and meet the normals. And that's like a little bit about like how journalists have often talked about their publics after a few beers. So I think that is a problem. But what the implication that it's Justin Trudeau somehow like twisting the arms of the CBC is just is just bonkers.
Yeah, and I also just wanted to quickly add to that, like what happened with the trucker protest and like the fact that they froze the bank accounts of like the truckers was outrageous. Like even though I hated what they stood for, like a government using that power, like you could imagine if it was like a progressive protest movement that all of a sudden they started freezing their bank accounts. I mean, it's ridiculous. But
and I'll just say one quick note on that. Like there's been an emerging powers like commission reviewing what happened there on a policy level. And I've actually found the reporting to be like surprisingly good, because people at those commissions are sort of less unlikable. So the journalists can report it a little bit more fairly. So there's been a bit of a reckoning, not totally, but a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I do think like oftentimes I get really frustrated by the way people talk about the trucker protests, which because like there's this really unhelpful polarization there, even within sort of left media kind of takes on it, or left adjacent, post left, whatever, which is either you think, oh, this is like this totally authentic, working class movement that is right, like, or you, or they're all Nazis, and you don't even point out what Victor just did about how incredibly disturbing the use of these emergency powers was, going after the bank accounts. So it's like, okay, I mean, you can admit that there's an element of astroturf, and there's like even calling it like the truckers movement. I mean, my understanding is itself pretty dubious, because that suggests that the people protesting are all truckers, or that they represent what most truckers thought. Which I mean, I'm grew up not far from the border, but I'm significantly less Canadian than half the people on here. So I probably have the least information about this, but like it seems like from what I saw, most actual truck drivers and polls disagreed with the truck protests, the support of the vaccination requirements, and I don't even think the majority of people who were there were truckers, right? But like, so you can make all those criticisms, but also think, okay, there's this massively unhelpful thing that we sometimes do in the left, where we see like a sort of protest with a right-wing valence, and we say like everybody there is a Nazi. It's like it's incredibly like alienated and inaccurate and stupid. Like you shouldn't do that. And
absolutely
be attentive to the civil liberty stuff, and it just seems like it'd be a lot easier to walk and chew bubblegum about that.
Yeah, there's also like this. I think this touches on what I think Gordon was saying, which is like there was always this. Or I think Victor raised the point, like, what's the evidence that the Canadian government is kind of pressuring the publicly funded like news companies on like telling them what to say and so on. And I just kind of like the insinuation where like even if you grant that, and you get like a similar thing when conservatives start talking about various policies, like, like Medicare for all, and they'll be like, you really want a suit in the government telling you when you should get healthcare? That's like, is a suit in a private company somehow supposed to be like significantly better? Like, do you not think that private companies have financial interests in terms of what stories get told, and that they would exert some of their control in the same way as you're saying the government will? That insinuation is a bit weird.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, look, I don't know specifically how the CBC is structured, but I know like the BBC, that there's like, or like PBS, which is the closest American equivalent, although it's obviously a much smaller presence in the American media landscape than those other two. Like, it's literally not like, there's this weird thing that people do where they think that if something is publicly owned or publicly funded and in a certain sense started by the government, like some of these media entities, that means that like, the president or the prime minister is like overseeing the operations of it and like has the power to tell them whatever wants to do. And that's just like literally not true. You have, like just in terms of the organizational structure that, that like there's actually like a fair amount of effort that's put into setting them up in a way where that won't be true. So it's like that, you have independent commissions, and you can like maybe appoint somebody to the board once every certain number of years, but it's like literally not like the president can like pick up the phone and say, here's how I want PBS to report something, or the prime minister could do that for these other media organizations. Whereas, like, look, there are actually like I mean, Jeff Bezos could literally just fire the editor-in-chief of the Washington Post if he really wanted to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, if anything, right? Like, you'd imagine it would be harder for the government to fire a public employee than it would be for a capitalist to fire a member of a private company, because there's more, legal complications in terms of like First Amendment stuff and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in the U.S., my favorite example of this is when Ronald Reagan was the governor of California. He used his influence to, in fact, try to get Angela Davis fired from the University of California system. Which there was even a law in the books in California at that point, like letting him do that, right? Like a 1950s, like anti-communist thing. But then, like the court said, no, you can't do that. She's a University of California is a public employer, like you're literally violating their constitutional rights if you fire somebody from the public sector for their political views.
Yeah, I mean, the CBC is definitely not like managed by the government in power. It's like its funding comes from the government purse, but it's apportioned out and then managed by a separate body. It does, however, have like legislative like values. Like it is enshrined in Canadian law in a specific way to advance a specific set of values, some of which are really good, like bilingualism, sort of nurturing Canadian culture, some of which are a little bit more questionable and sort of like nation building and culture solidifying and myth making kind of ethos that the CBC has. I think we can debate about that, but the best thing about it is that we can debate about that and we can decide that. Whereas we can't with the Washington Post. That's just whatever Bezos wants it to be.
It also just seems like the whole public funding point is like weirdly tangential to like the topic of the debate. Like most mainstream media, at least like in the US, isn't publicly owned. So like, should we trust those ones? Or like, I don't, it just seems like, the argument that like, oh, some mainstream media is like publicly funded. It's like, I mean, I guess that's an argument against like a certain subset of mainstream media, but certainly like not all of it.
Yeah, so like that wouldn't apply to trusting the New York Times or the Toronto Star or whatever it is. Yeah.
And by the way, on the note of the New York Times, I looked it up. Like I did a quick search briefly when he mentioned the thing about the Queen, because I was like, there's just no way that's right, that they were just, shitting all over the Queen after she died. And I mean, literally every article I can find is like a gushing, like here's a verbatim subhead, like Queen Elizabeth dies at 96. She ruled for 7 decades, unshakably committed to the rituals of her role amid epic social and economic change. Like, I mean, it just seems,
if that's a good piece, it's really not reflected in the
deck.
Yeah, he just throws in lies like Douglas Murray. He's just, I don't know, compared to the others, I just feel like he's so slimy. And with the frustrating thing too, which came through, I feel like a little bit in the video, but when I was there, came through. It's like the amount of clapping was really frustrating and disheartening for like how many people loved what Douglas Murray had to say. It was pretty disturbing.
Yeah, fair enough. All right. Maybe we should keep going.
You're going to get the final opening statement today, so take us away.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back home. I thought I'd just tell 2 very simple stories. One of them will not be about the truckers, who I think have been well defended by my colleague, Mr. Murray. My first story is I spent the first 10 years of my journalism career at the Washington Post, which that is the definition of the mainstream media. And this was from the mid 80s to the mid 90s, in the era of the mainstream media's greatest influence. And the 2 things, it was there that I learned my trade as a journalist. And there were 2 things that were drilled into me at my time there. One was the importance of fairness. If you quoted someone denouncing someone else, you had to call up the person who was denounced and get a response. X said something about Y, you had to call Y and find out how they felt about what X said. You had to make a good faith effort to talk to all sides of an issue. And if you did not do that, your story did not appear in the paper, right? Second thing that was very important was accuracy. I remember once I did a story about a mall in Buffalo, and it was an upscale mall, and they had the bus stop across a busy highway from the mall. They didn't want anyone, the sort of person who came on a bus, to come to the mall. And in the course of writing this story, I talked about what the bus service was. It was the Amherst bus. And I said, even the bus doesn't come from the city of Buffalo. That was an error, a dumb, stupid error. The next day, the bus service and the mall and the city of Buffalo called the paper very angrily, demanded a correction, which they got the next day in a very prominent place. And I was pulled in by my editor and given a dressing down that I remember to this day, right? I mean, basically, I was told I was this close to being fired. That's how seriously the paper took the commitment to accuracy in its pages. Now, Matt would have you believe that those two principles are no longer a part of the brief of the mainstream media. I would like to say to him, that's completely false. He is so far removed from the mainstream media that I think he has a naive view about what goes on inside those institutions. They remain committed to a professional set of ideals that they have held for decades. Story number 2. I was on a British podcast this summer, very much a media platform that is not part of the mainstream media. And it was a long 2-hour interview. And in the course of this, my host went on a long and impassioned critique of working from home. And I very briefly chimed in with a few thoughts of my own. I agreed with some of what he said and didn't agree with other things. Thought nothing of it because he occupied about 90% of that conversation. Then in the following week, when the podcast came out, they released a clip which was just of my contribution, making it sound like it was my impassioned rant. And then someone on social media picked it up and said that in the course of this impassioned rant, I had burst into tears, which was not true. And then someone else found a picture. We had moved into new offices, my company, and I had tweeted out a picture of my office because I was so proud of it. And someone took that picture online and said, this is Gladwell's picture of the office he works from home, which was nuts. But everyone believed that too. And so word got around the internet that I was someone who worked from home, believed everyone else should not work from home, and was so overwhelmed emotionally with my hypocrisy that I was close to tears. The height of it was I was trending on Twitter for a while. It was quite an extraordinary experience. The height of it was when some blogger in Philadelphia wrote a story saying this is exactly the kind of hypocrisy you should expect from a single childless man who never leaves his apartment. And so I called it up and said, I'm not single, I'm not childless, and I don't have an apartment, and I go to the office every day and have done so for years. And he said, I'll correct it. But then, of course, he never did. And in the course of the entire controversy, only one reporter called me to try and set the record straight. And where did that reporter work? In the mainstream media. Now, I've been talking, or others have been talking about content, the content of the things that people in the mainstream media say and the problems they have with that content. I don't think the issue here is content. The issue here is process, right? The issue here is the mainstream media has a set of professional norms in place that work the best way they can towards the production of fairness and accuracy. The non-mainstream media is a set of institutions that are outside of that tradition, that have an open and not a closed platform. And you cannot have an open platform and simultaneously adhere to a strict set of professional norms. You cannot say anyone can become a doctor and then complain when the surgeon takes out your spleen and thinking that it's your gallbladder, right? Now, why am I making such a big deal about this? Because trust is not about content. Trust is about process. And there is one institution here that it strikes me has a commitment to the right kind of process, and a whole set of other institutions that most assuredly do not.
Wow. Thank you, guys.
Maybe this is a little bit unfair, but I just kept imagining this story being told in the voice of Donald Trump. Yeah, they're very unfair. They said, they said that I didn't like working. I never said I didn't want to work at home. It's very unfair.
They came up to him. They were like, "Sir," that's how all of his stories start. Yeah, I mean, it's just sort of, I guess like. I guess it's just, it was a little bit weird, that statement, because I mean, towards the end, you kind of got like a mechanistic argument, like, here's why, the mainstream media is like a bit more, there's more processes in place to like weed out inaccuracy, but mainstream media people can say literally whatever they want with no process that they have to adhere to. So, I mean, I guess maybe that mechanistic consideration is somewhat interesting. The rest of it just seemed like, I guess, like anecdotes. Although in fairness, that's pretty much what everyone else offered as well.
Yeah, I found this like incredibly condescending. Like, what the basic points is that we're the only people that can treat people fairly and care about facts. Like, give me a fucking break. I mean, what he's talking about is basically like gatekeeping, credentialization, and like boundary work, right, to be able to claim like who has those professional bona fides to be a journalist. And like, to put my cards on the table here, like, I'm an alternative journalist, and I was taking notes on what his like basic professional values are. I'll get behind all those, like call people if you attack them, try not to make mistakes, treat people fairly, have like some sense of context when you report on something. Like, I just think that's a really low bar. And it's not just like anyone can have, like a blogger can have those same kinds of values. So if you are going to make a process statement, at least make something slightly more sophisticated. Like,
well, especially because he was conflating those values, maybe that's your point, with the what your credentials are. Like his analogy about the doctors. Right?
Exactly.
It's like, it's like trying to be a doctor if you didn't go to medical school, you don't have proper training. It's like, well, okay, but like, if you need to, like, right, you need to go to journal, you need to have like an academic degree, or like, to follow the norm. Like, if you're gonna print somebody like denouncing something, you should like give them a phone call, give them a chance to respond. Because like I feel like that could be like, I feel like if you want everybody who works for your media organization to do that, like, you can just kind of tell them on the first day. You don't really need to make sure that they've passed like some sort of like years of academic training.
Yeah, I mean, I felt, Gordon, I mean, I see what you're saying, but I feel like a little like less hypercritical of what he was trying to say. Like, I do think that the fact is the mainstream media, for the most part, does have this process in place, and it's also true that a lot of alternative journalists also have that in place, like you have that. But there's also a lot of alternative media that doesn't have that process in place, including probably someone like Douglas Murray, insofar as he is an alternative source of media information. So like, yeah, I think the way he did it was, I mean, he definitely comes across as a certain brand of like snobby elitist, kind of like liberal, and like I could see the way like there's kind of condescension in the way he was talking. But I just think it is true that the mainstream media is the only one that you can say reliably. I mean, even the reporters at Fox News, right? The actual reporters, not the commentaries, right? They, for the most part, do follow those basic standards of process. And I think that's important. And I think if you're going to trust some sort of source of information, I still think they're your best bet.
I will say, like, the other thing that bothered me about his story is it's like, whatever. I mean, I'm sure that's like really frustrating that, like, some like really inaccurate telephone game stuff is said about you online, and lots of people believe it. Which, I mean, in a small way, I've got some experience with, but like like to have that happen on a much larger scale, I'm sure is that's bad, right? But it's like, also, to what extent does any of this like really rebound to the credit of mainstream media? Because like, well, the one person who called me, which suggests that like most mainstream media sources, including presumably the ones who reported on the story, did not get in touch with them. unless this was like literally the only mainstream media organization that reported on this. So the one person was, was the mainstream media. It's like, okay, but like also, this is not a great test because you're Malcolm Gladwell, right? You're somebody who would be friends with, or at least be respected by, a lot of mainstream journalists, right? Like I would be frankly much more impressed if it was somebody that like, mainstream, like elite liberal like journalists hated, and it was like this extremely sort of petty and unimportant but personally frustrating thing that happened to him, where people were like believe something inaccurate about him, and then mainstream reporters were reaching out to him to see if it were true.
Yeah, like I guess to your point, Victor, I was sort of more perturbed by the tone than the content, admittedly, because I do think that like professionalism is important, and like I do think that process is important, and a robust news organization that takes its values seriously can develop those and maintain those. I just don't think it's necessarily that the mainstream media is the only one, or particularly even the best emblem of some of those values. And so the kind of like, well, we have it, no one else does, that sort of triumphalism, I think is sort of really unhelpful. Even if you believe them to have it more than others, you should take a more critical stance and ensure that those are sort of like strengthened when in actual fact they're being sort of weakened consistently as newsrooms are being hollowed out. So the triumphalism really just gets me.
Yeah, and it also seems like, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say quickly, like, that's fair. But I think like part of the problem from the perspective of like a news consumer is that how do you know that this alternative media source actually is following the process? And I think there are good reasons to think that the mainstream media is following it. Of course you are. I mean, there's a lot of alternative journalists who are following it, but I think from the perspective of just like a media consumer, it's like, who should I trust? There is reason to think that they will. And also kind of on the point, like the language of gatekeeping, I got to say like that language, I mean, sometimes I find it's like, sometimes gates are good. Like, let's have a gate and let's keep it. Sometimes it's good to keep them, but I feel like in a certain kind of culture, in kind of like critical academia, I feel like it's become one of those terms that everyone uses like, to like as like a pejorative term, but it's like actually kind of good sometimes.
It's like tone policing. It's like, yeah, look, tone police brutality surely exists, but I'm not sure I'm willing to sign on to tone police abolitionism. Like, I think that the tone probably does need to be policed a little. But yeah, I mean, I guess I'd just say, like, although this does go back to one of the first points Ethan made, we talked about several times, which is just like, what are the terms of this debate, right? And what exactly are we arguing about? Because, like, if the claim is like process is better than no process, right? That like having certain ground rules in place to ensure accuracy is better than not. Okay, fair enough. But like then that by itself doesn't even tell us much yet about what we should think about mainstream media, because like now the new questions are like, okay, how's mainstream media doing, like even like implementing that process, right? Because it does seem like there are some pretty straightforward process ways in which standards actually have deteriorated, like in terms of like numbers of sources you need, for example, before you can report something. I mean, like that there are, I think, some, pretty high profile example, like mainstream examples of, like this used to, I mean, that one, at the risk of sounding like Matt Taibbi's opening statement, did used to be pretty sacrosanct. I mean, if you watch like All the President's Men, right, it's a really big deal, right? We're gonna get up to our 3 sources so we can report this thing, and a lot of that stuff, like you literally just have like one guy pick up a call and be like anonymously quoted, and you just like print what he told you. Like that's, which is not great. So it's like, I think that's still consistent with what Victor is saying. If the question is, okay, is mainstream media better than, the available alternatives for certain things, then it's like, that could still be true, right? Like even if the process isn't what it should be, or in some ways even what it was, which also goes to what Gordon was saying about hollowing out of newsrooms, that like you literally just don't have as many people to report on as many things, like you don't have you don't have like the local or regional paper with the guy whose job is just to go to the state legislature every day, and like report on what they're talking about. So that makes you way more vulnerable to interest groups, just like feeding you something and you just like report the fact that they told you.
I think maybe something that touches on what Ben just said, but also what Victor and Gordon were saying is like, I think that so his point is supposed to be that you should trust mainstream media, and I think that that's a little bit vague, but it seems like he wants to say that you should really trust the mainstream media, like that should be the source that we trust, and we shouldn't trust the alternatives more than mainstream media or something like that. And then he makes these arguments like sort of most alternative media sources, or maybe many alternative media sources, don't have these rigorous processes in place to ensure accuracy, and more mainstream media companies have that processes than non-mainstream media companies. But that seems like an overly broad comparison with respect to the point that's being made, because like surely if you could even find a subset of alternative media that has better processes in place than mainstream media, then sort of the conclusion of the argument that like the mainstream media should be the thing we defer to would sort of collapse. Because like, sure, maybe most alternative media isn't as good. Maybe the average alternative media source isn't as good as the average alternative mainstream media source, but maybe there are alternative media sources that are better than all the rest, including all the alternative and non-alternative media sources. And I think that would be like a super relevant fact to assess whether or not that's true, given the terms of this debate, I guess.
Yeah, you could also just disambiguate, right? You can trust or not trust things in different ways. Like, so it could be that like, if the question is, okay, on a day-to-day basis, right, is like a pretty good rule of thumb that if like there's like some like not analysis, not predictions, but like literally just like a claim that like something happened somewhere in the world yesterday, and like you read it in the New York Times, is like a pretty good rule of thumb. Yeah, that like probably happened, right? Like it's like, yeah, clearly yes, right? Like I mean, I say a rule of thumb because there are also obviously exceptions to that, like. And you can, I would hope, like have other heuristics that you use besides just like, okay, who reported it? Is this like reasonably? It's like also like, I don't know. Like I was talking to a friend earlier today about like the, if anybody remembers, like a few years ago, the Russian bounties in Afghanistan story. Like Russia is like paying the Taliban to kill American soldiers in Afghanistan, which I remember, I'm sure that, at least the rumor of that was reported in all sorts of mainstream sources and people believed on the basis of that. But it's like, I just think you can like have a certain, like this is not a very rigorous way to put it, but like you can have a certain like bullshit radar, right? Like that's like, does that sound like it's probably true? Like, that sounds like it's probably bullshit. So I'm gonna like wait until like I read an article that like at least claims that there's like pretty direct evidence that the reporter personally saw, not just like somebody told them this. And like, and you can also just think, okay, so you can think, all right, one like rule of thumb could be if I read something in the New York Times says there's something that happened yesterday. Generally speaking, I'm going to think that that's probably true, unless it seems really thinly sourced and it like sets off my bullshit detector, in which case maybe I'll remember while I look into it more. Like that seems like it's probably a pretty good rule of thumb, but then like you could also think like there's certain ways in which you trust certain kinds of alternative media more, that like that you think that with claims for which there's like, like at the very least, you think they're going to provide better analysis or, provide more context or, like something like that. Like, you could think that there are ways in which you trust them more that are consistent with like that are consistent with like basically you don't think that like the lizard people who run the New York Times are just giving you a totally alternate reality, and that like what they report day to day isn't going to be true.
Yeah, it's also a bit humorous that probably like most of the people who are sort of buying this idea that like, you know, the New York Times, when they say things, you should probably like disbelieve it, or maybe you shouldn't trust it very much, will like sign on to like Trumpian claims such as that he won like Michigan's Man of the Year award, which does not exist.
No, I won that a couple times.
Yeah. I was like, oh, I've lived here my whole life. I've never heard about it. Like I've never been to the committee selection criteria. I'm not familiar with.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is absolutely true. Like it is like amazing how people will go from like, you know, there are a significant number of like really important cases that mainstream sources have gotten wrong, true, to I'm just going to believe whatever kind of like psychotic bullshit, you know, like I hear from people that I happen to like.
Yeah, it's like sort of, I guess, like selective demands for rigor, I guess. You sort of.
The New York Times, you know, the New York Times like printed lies about weapons of mass destruction. So now I'm just going to go to InfoWars and believe whatever they say.
Yeah, I feel like there's kind of a danger of like moving the goalposts on, again, I mean, we've talked about this a lot, but what do we mean by trust? Because if the question is like, does the media, the mainstream media, like flat out lie very often? I think we're all in agreement that that's like not the case. And like when they make a claim of fact, you can like mostly believe it to be true. I think like the more interesting question is like, what version of reality does it give you on the whole based on their like the kinds of stories they cover and the people that they quote? And so they're making claims against like far right conspiracy theorists and people that they're implying when they talk about alternative media, but like that's not really what like a sophisticated left critique of media looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I think just quickly, I would say that I think that's true. I think I'm interpreting the question as I'm in the position of like a regular person who like is like medium educated. And it's like the question is, I'm looking for information. Should I generally trust the mainstream media? And it's like, and in my opinion, it's just like the best source that we have. So like you generally should. They're not going to lie. There's going to be inaccuracies. There's problems. There's critiques we can make about all institutions in society as being like problematic for all sorts of ways. But as a general rule, I feel like if you have to answer no to that question, I just feel like it opens the door to just like really weird, like either weird skepticism or just like, and I agree with Ethan's point before too, that there probably are some alternative media sources that are doing it better than any of the mainstream media. But as a regular consumer, how am I going to know that? It's like, I actually do have good grounds to think that generally what the mainstream media is saying is going to be by and large accurate when it comes to reporting.
Yeah, I mean, it's like if you have no other evidence one way or the other about which sources are better, you know, it seems like if almost everybody is listening to these people and then these other sources are like more marginal, my instinct would probably go to the one more people are listening to. You know, if you take other humans to be generally like not completely confused about what they're doing.
All right, let's go back to it.
Some terrific opening statements. That's what the Munk debate is all about. You've heard these different arguments. Now we're going to get into rebuttals. It's an opportunity for each of our debaters to confront their opponent's ideas. You can follow along our running poll. The prompts are on the monitors, stage right and left. Let us know how you think this debate is unfolding in real time. But Matt Taibbi, you get the first opportunity to rebut what you've heard from Michelle and Malcolm.
Well, first of all, I think I should respond to Michelle, who simply misquoted me, proving my point. I never once said the media doesn't want you to hear about ivermectin. I don't care about ivermectin. What I wrote about was people being deleted from the internet by platforms like Facebook for talking about ivermectin, which I don't believe in. I believe people should be able to talk about what they want without being removed from the internet. You're going to be the second person who's going to owe me a correction after this 538.com has already done that, made that mistake. Malcolm, you seem to think I've never worked in the mainstream media. I spent 15 years at Rolling Stone. I spent all that time writing 7,000 word features that had to be fact checked every line. I'm absolutely familiar with the process of mainstream media, and that's why I'm so disappointed in what happened. The New York Times and the entire, basically, mainstream media spent years following a fake story about Donald Trump being in league with Vladimir Putin to fix the 2016 election. It was a wrong story. We have a leaked audio tape that was published in Slate.com where the editor of the New York Times says, well, we got caught a little flat-footed on that one because, our readers who want Donald Trump to go away are going to be disappointed about this. He says, we built our entire newsroom around one story, and they got it wrong. There's no way to defend that kind of inaccuracy, and it only happens if everybody wants so badly for it to be true that they overlook all the guardrails that are in place. No serious journalist that I know looked at that story and didn't have qualms about it. So yes, there are processes in place, and there was once an ethos in place, but that ethos is gone now. And maybe the processes remain, but there are too many errors proving otherwise.
Thanks, Matt. I'm going to make a slight adjustment here on the clock because these rebuttals should be 3 minutes each, not 2. So I'll figure a way to get you another minute somewhere in this debate, Matt. So we'll get that changed or keep an eye on it. Let it count down for an extra minute because I want you to have your full 3 minutes.
I apologize for misquoting you, although I think I've read a lot of your writing on ivermectin, and I know that you've written quite a bit about deplatforming internet censorship. You've also said that we should be reporting on ivermectin. Did you not? Is that incorrect?
That was not the sense of those stories. The idea was Facebook was taking people off the internet for writing about ivermectin, and I was saying,
okay, well, this is something checkable, so we can. But I wanted to speak more broadly. Well, first of all, I mean, it's unfortunate that this is not a debate about was Donald Trump's relationships with Russia improper, so that I could be arguing the pro side. But I'm not going to go deep into the weeds of that. I do want to go into the weeds of the Ottawa trucker protests because I might have been the only one of us. Did you cover them? No. So I think I might have been the only one of us who was at the Ottawa trucker protest.
Glad to hear it.
And you know, I'm the kind of one of the liberal columnists at the Times. I've covered the far right. I showed up at the Ottawa trucker protests, kind of expecting the sort of things that I've seen at Donald Trump rallies, at various even further right events, and didn't find it. You know, I was really quite astonished. I think that it's been pretty conclusively shown that the organizers of this protest were people on the far right, were people with very kind of unsavory and sometimes racist ideas. But what really shocked me walking around and talking to people was how many people were just either totally politically disconnected. I remember getting into a truck with someone saying, "What inspired you to come here?" And he said, "Mushrooms." You know, he was tripping, and he had this desire to get in his car and drive. You know, but there was a lot of people who were just traumatized. They were lonely. They were so happy to suddenly be surrounded by people after having been isolated for so long. People were hugging each other. People were hugging me, even though I'm from the hated mainstream media. And I told my editors that this is what I found, and they said, "Great. That's more interesting than what we thought you were going to find." It was more interesting. And I wrote it, and they devoted an entire page to it. I'm not going to defend all of the mainstream media coverage of the Ottawa trucker protests. I didn't follow every single bit of reporting on it in the Canadian media. But I do think that having the ethos of wanting to be surprised and being willing to be surprised is something that you are more likely to find in, you know, the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in people who write, you know, in the New Yorker, than it is with people who do write for some of these contrarian alternatives to the mainstream media. And they really do start with a story that they want to, a story that they intend to tell, often a story about the mistakes and dishonesties of the mainstream media. But the truth is much more complicated than that.
Thank you, Michelle.
Okay, Douglas, same opportunity for you. 3 minutes on the clock. Let's have your rebuttal.
Thanks very much. I'm delighted you went to the protests. I'm sorry I was on another story at the time. And I'm delighted that you reported honestly, since you didn't report Matt's comments honestly tonight. And the last time you were on this stage with Jordan Peterson, you didn't report his comments accurately either. Let me address the main point that has come out from the other side, which is that the mainstream media has frailties. Sure, it has frailties. And nobody is saying that non-mainstream media don't have frailties. Of course they do. The simple proposal in front of the audience tonight is whether or not you can trust the mainstream media. That is, that you don't need anything else. You don't need any other information from elsewhere. You can just turn on CBC in the evening and you know you've got your stuff. You can pick up the New York Times, the Washington Post in the morning, and you know that there's no spin on the story. It's absolutely accurate reporting. I was interested by Malcolm's story about himself because I wonder, Malcolm, if you hadn't have been yourself, whether you would have got that call from a journalist. I wonder if you weren't yourself, if you weren't a New York Times best-selling author, if you didn't speak to audiences like this. I wonder if you're just an ordinary member of the public who'd been grossly defamed in the mainstream media, whether they'd have bothered with you. I'd submit no, because time and again that's been shown to be the case. Now look, as I say, you don't have to believe this evening that you should never read the mainstream media. What we're simply saying, among other things, is, firstly, the mainstream media isn't the mainstream media that it used to be when we were all, sorry, some of you are a lot younger, but when most of us were growing up, okay? It's just not the same thing. It's running for money, it's running for cash, it's running for ratings and much more. It's just a different mainstream media, and you do need outside sources in that. You do need upstart blogs. You don't only need them, you don't need only read them, but you do need them. The second thing is, again, I come back to it, if the mainstream media today wants to put a spin on a story, they can do it all the way. Look at what happened the other day with the Colorado gay bar shooting in America. Again, we're in Canada, I don't want to talk just about America. Look at this, an appalling event. Somebody goes up and shoots up a gay bar. Whole load of the media start talking about the right wing, about the right wing shock jocks who've caused this. They go on and on about it day after day until, oh, it turns out the man taken into custody is non-binary. Story disappears. That would have been a really interesting story to keep on at. But it just goes away because the narrative isn't the one that the mainstream media wanted. It's too complex. So I applaud you, Michelle, when you go and find complex stories and you explain the complexity. But that's not the habit of the mainstream media anymore.
Thank you, Douglas. Okay, our last rebuttal is from Malcolm. Malcolm, take us away.
A couple things that I'm puzzled over. One is that I thought that since you guys were in favor of the proposition, you would at some point have given us a definition of what you meant when you used the phrase mainstream media. I'm still waiting for that because what it seems to me that you're doing is you're giving a bunch of very cogent and accurate critiques of the media, but the proposition before us is not that the media behaves nicely and well all the time. It's whether the mainstream media does. And without you giving us any direction about what you mean with that phrase, I'm a little lost. And for example, Douglas, I noticed in your comments to me right now, you said that would I have been called if I were not who I am? It was a very puzzling locution, but if I were someone else, would I have been called if I had been, quote, and I'm quoting from you, if someone else had been, quote, grossly defamed in the mainstream media. But I wasn't grossly defamed in the mainstream media. I was grossly defamed in the non-mainstream media, which is my point, right? Second thing was, I was greatly amused by the affection Matt Taibbi has for the age of Walter Cronkite, which he seemed to hold up as a kind of golden moment. In that moment, the mainstream media was populated entirely by white men from elite schools. Why you would have had such affection and say that's the gold standard, and we should trust the mainstream media precisely at the moment when the mainstream media is least representative, is really puzzling to me. I would point out that at the height of Walter Cronkite's reign in American media, neither people like Michelle and I wouldn't have been on the stage, right? We weren't part of the conversation. So I don't know why we should hold such a kind of affection for that moment. I was also struck by the contradictions between the comments that both of you made. When Douglas said that he was very upset at the way the Canadian media acted as an amen chorus of the Canadian government with respect to the truckers, I would just point out that the reason Walter Cronkite was so beloved by people like Matt Taibbi's father and grandfather is that he was an amen chorus for the United States government. So the two of you should really get together in the next 5 minutes and work out your story. One last comment, and that is, I was most amused by the particular subjects that seem to have excited the imagination and outrage of the two of you. I'll just list them before I go in my last 19 seconds. Donald Trump's relationship with Russia, the Canadian truckers, ivermectin, Jordan Peterson, and then something about this thing in... These aren't things driven by the mainstream media. These are obsessions of the non-mainstream media. Once again, work it out, guys. Donald...
All right. Just want to quickly point out two things here. One, it's amazing to claim that Donald Trump isn't an obsession of the mainstream media.
Yeah.
I'm literally, sorry, stricken silent by that for a second. That's such a bizarre thing to claim. I mean, yeah. I mean, Trump was the obsession of the mainstream media for, really in some ways until now, but like certainly until he was taken off Twitter, so you could no longer just like see his tweets float up in your timeline and write stories about them. But also the Cronkite stuff is really weird to me because he said that this is a point where I think, tell me if I'm misremembering his exact phrasing, but I think he said this was a time when mainstream media was just dominated by white men who went to the most elite colleges. I think that was the phrase.
Mm-hmm.
So, which I think is like, look, I'll give you 2 out of 3. White, yes, for sure. Men, for sure. Elite colleges,
No.
right? That's
working class profession.
Exactly, it's way more true in 2023 than it was in Walter Cronkite era. In fact, which is one of Matt Taibbi's main points. In fact, as Gordon was alluding to earlier. In fact, after he said that, I got curious and I just quickly pulled up Walter Cronkite's Wikipedia page. He went to UT Austin.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good school, but
fine school, but like that's not the Ivy League.
Yeah, no, for sure. I also just found the. I just found the insinuation that, like, I thought that was that was kind of a miss for me. That weird, like, rhetorical insinuation that Malcolm Gladwell was making. If I caught his drift, that somehow the reason Taibbi likes the Walter Cronkite era was because they were white.
Yeah,
and because like that. I don't know. That to me is just one of those weird rhetorical kind of like wokey like insinuations that I just like really don't like. I think you can make an argument about how it's weird that he's romanticizing the Cronkite era, but to like make it this weird point that like the reason you did that, it's weird that you liked it when everyone was white. Like,
I totally agree with that. It just seemed like, his point was like, Matt wants to say that, the Walter Cronkite era was great in all respects, but here's a respect in which it was bad. It wasn't diverse enough. And it's like, yeah, maybe that is a respect in which it was bad. But I don't think Matt Taibbi's point was as simple or as broad as everything about the media at that point was good. I think it was more specific. Like at that point, I mean, the context in which he brought up Walter Cronkite was like, I think something about a poll that like he was like the most trusted man in America. And now, people don't trust media people as much. And that kind of shows how media allegiance has become more like fragmented, and I think that probably played into his like mechanistic argument as like media has become more fragmented, so we'd expect them more to tailor their coverage to specifically their political side relative to what used to happen. So I think like the argument was much more like specific and nuanced than just like, you know, something that could be debunked by pointing out one respect in which the media at that time was like suboptimal.
Also, I genuinely have no idea. He said me and Michelle would be allowed on stage. It's like, okay, I guess Michelle Goldberg, because she's a woman, although even that seems like a huge overstatement, but whatever, put that aside, right? Like as if there were like literally no women in media, you know, in this era. Like obviously it was much more male dominated, but you know, he's overstated his case. But like, why the fuck would Malcolm Gladwell be on stage? Like, it's I didn't even understand that part. Is there some?
Is it a point about Jew? Is it Jewish? Jewish?
I think he's Jewish and mixed race. So it's
was
possible.
there ever a point where like Jews were not allowed in media? I thought that was like one of their advantages.
I heard from my good friend Alex Jones that you know, yeah. But no,
this claim that Jews weren't allowed in the media is not what I gleaned from a few years of listening to Richard Spencer. But
exactly.
I mean,
like seriously, even when the United States was much more anti-Semitic, like I'm fairly sure that didn't manifest itself through there being no Jewish journalists.
Yeah,
I think the broader point that like the golden age wasn't so gold is like it's well taken, even though that's not really what was, you know, it misfires in terms of a debate against or a point against Matt Taibbi for all the reasons that we mentioned because of the insinuation that's just made without comment. But one of the things I wonder is if we had an uncritical trust of the media throughout that entire period, would it have become a more diverse place? Right? Because there's a case to be made, oh, well, Walter Cronkite is very trustworthy. Why do we need to diversify? So one of the reasons why I sort of lean towards the don't trust the media, because it seems to me that a healthy skepticism of the media is a productive approach to sort of understanding it as a dynamic institution that should be sort of agitated against, improved, and changed. And that's where I think his like point about the media improving is a point in favor of not trusting it, or not just like being uncritically accepting of the mainstream media.
Yeah,
that's fair. I think.
Okay, yeah, please.
Yeah. Just quickly, I think that's a good attitude to have as an academic. Like, I think it's good to be critical, but like, I don't know, maybe I'm being like overly black pill about like the public, but sorry, like a lot of the public is not gonna like, you know, develop a super nuanced skeptical take about like we should trust this and we should. I mean, most fucking people can't even read an article to the end. Like, I don't know. I like that's a nice ideal. But you know, even as an academic myself, I just think sometimes we can have a tendency, I don't know, maybe you're not doing this, Gordon, but sometimes I feel like we can have a tendency to be like, oh, like I have really nuanced takes because I learned about all these things. And like, we should just cultivate that in the public. And I think I'm just like a little bit less optimistic about that possibility.
Yeah, you're way more jaundiced than I be, because I find like your average sort of working class like person that's not inculcated in an academic context can very quickly give you a media analysis that's just as sophisticated as anything you learn in a communications program. Like it's owned by capitalists. It's, you know, for all the things that you've been talking about.
I would really push back, Victor, because like I think that there is a certain way I almost can't imagine a like anything politically useful happening without the kind of movement, you know, the kind of mass movement where your average participant in that movement, you know, and like, look, there are degrees of which people are going to like bring analytic nuance to these things, of course, right? I mean, but like,
Victor called his people, had them cut the internet.
Yeah, I think.
What happened to the marketplace of ideas?
No, it's fun. It's been fun though, Gordon. I like that we found some things to have some light disagreement on.
I think what we should all do is start getting Ben's supporters to increase their donations so that this guy can get better internet.
Yeah, totally. I think Ben's been in Mexico lately, and I don't want to generalize that everyone in Mexico doesn't have good internet, but although to be honest, like even when he was doing his debate breakdowns, I don't know, Ethan, if you remember, but I feel like his internet's always been kind of choppy.
You think so? I think that could be true. Sometimes I'd wonder whether it was mine or whether it was his.
No.
Yeah.
I think it was his. Oh, here he is. He's back.
Yeah. Yeah, got kicked off Wi-Fi again. I'm not quite sure what happened there, but
Victor was just besmirching the good people of Mexico and saying they're technologically backward.
That's not what I said.
I'm actually not in Mexico this second. I'm in San Diego.
Okay.
What group of people can't you infantilize, Victor?
Although I think although I don't know how connected it is to Mexico, I believe that city named San Diego, I believe that's actually from German. I believe that's a whale's vagina in German.
A reliable news source.
Yes. Well, I actually did hear that from a newsreader, so you know. In any case, that's. I was just gonna say though, like, I think that I think that like mass movements that are effective tend to cultivate participants who are skeptical of at least certain kinds of things about mainstream media. Like, I mean, like just an obvious example would be like any sort of effective, labor, socialist, communist kind of movement. I mean, like, you're going to have people who are just sort of going to generally think like, yeah, the capitalist press is going to lie about strikes and, stuff like that. Right. Like, and not trust like certain kinds of things that they read in those sources about that. And, that much seems like, I guess I would just say like, I don't think the only options for like non-academics or, or just people who aren't like super political, whatever, like are just like either they just don't have a critique of mainstream media or they think it's the lizard people. Like, I think that, I think like, I think that you can have like a mass of ordinary people who do have like who do have like a certain amount of hostility to mainstream media for some of the right reasons without it devolving into just like total stupidity and conspiracism.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're probably right. I think I'm being too much I'm being too skeptical of the general public's ability, probably from spending too much time on Twitter.
Yeah,
well, you could opt in for like you could opt in for the classic Leninist idea where you just have these intellectuals and they debate and then they come to a resolution and vote and tell everybody else what they accept uncritically.
That doesn't seem like a great idea.
Yeah, maybe not. All right, so we did decide behind the scenes that rather than go into, I mean, here on the West Coast, the night is still young, but I know it's not where the three of you are, and so if we went for another 2 hours, which is probably what it would take us to get through the remaining hour of the video. That would probably be unreasonable on you guys' end. It'd be like 1 a.m. So I think we are going to call this part 1. We ended after the rebuttals, which seems like a pretty good way to end. And we will do part 2 next Thursday and finish it up. So do people have kind of, we haven't seen the whole thing yet, but, tentatively final thoughts for tonight?
I thought it sort of, I don't know, maybe my sort of like epistemic standards are just too demanding or something, but I was just thinking like, this is so unrigorous and unsystematic, like everything about the debate, like the terms are poorly defined. Everybody's kind of just like presenting anecdotes or like cherry picking examples that fit their narrative. Nobody's really providing some sort of like systematic analysis that would give us like good reason to think one way or the other about the proportion of stories that like the mainstream media gets wrong. or anything like that. So I guess it's just been a little frustrating from that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, like Taibbi, I think you gotta like, I said some critical things about him earlier. I and Gordon said some critical things even about his opening statement, but like credit where credit's due. I mean, he's got to be the guy out of those four who's come the closest to that.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, I think Taibbi, watching this again too, from seeing it in person, I do feel more disappointed than I remembered. Although I was disappointed at the time in like the people supporting the mainstream media argument. I still think overall, I think where I'm coming at things is although alternative media could mean so many different things, I just like really don't like the role that a lot of what goes by alternative media, like the role it's playing in society. And I think, I just worry about accepting that proposition as vaguely defined as it is. I just don't want. There's just so much garbage alternative media that has such worse incentives than the mainstream media to just keep saying things that their audience wants to hear. It's like almost worse than like the traditional incentives of like a corporate media environment. Like I feel like this new, like YouTube sphere of alternative media where, there's just so many big figures who have millions of followers who their whole incentive structure is like the feedback they're instantly getting on like the chats, right? And it's like if they say anything that goes against the ideological line, it's like they get instant feedback to like not do that again. And I feel like we're seeing that with figures like like the Tim Pools and the Jordan Petersons and stuff like that, and that's just the worst.
Totally. I mean, like the way that Peterson keeps, like, I mean, it's possible that there's like, and I'm not being funny here, like that this is like literally true, that there's like some kind of deteriorated mental condition going on, but like but if not, right, or maybe in combination with that, like he just keeps like it's just funny. Like you watch like the shit that he tweets, and it's like he just keeps saying progressively more ludicrous things that like the only way it can make sense to me is that like he's just learned that like what his audience will reward him for. And he's just like leading more and more and more aggressively into it until like it sounds like sometimes it almost sounds like not even like good AI, right? But like sort of not very good AI, like he's just kind of combining like culture war buzzwords, it's like, well, I guess trans blah blah blah. Right now, man.
I was actually. Yeah. Well, I was just gonna say I was kind of psychoanalyzing him, like kind of the other day. I was just thinking about that. I was watching him.
My favorite pastime.
I think I was maybe watching like him on Joe Rogan recently or something. I can't remember where I was watching some clips of him, and I remember thinking that his like I was imagining that in his head, I think he must be justifying only framing things from one side, because I think in people like his mind, the whole rest of the world is pushing this one narrative. And it's like he needs to be a counterbalance. So he's only going to say the other side. And I feel like that's like a way in his mind that he justifies. Whereas like I think the truth is like if you're going to be like an honest, nuanced actor, like you have to be the one who actually reiterates both sides. So like, he was having some critique of like how communism, but can lead to, tyrannical power structures, but was saying nothing about the way that capital can do the same thing. And I was just like, anyway, so I was just like imagining, I was like, he must justify this by just thinking, well, everyone else is getting the other side, so I've got to say this side. And that's just like the worst part of, I think, like this kind of alternative sphere.
Yeah, I mean, to go to maybe like reinforce your point, I mean, one thing I was thinking is that like some of the stuff that Taibbi has rightly pointed out about mainstream media actually applies even more so to at least certain kinds of alternative media that like that you just have that you're not trying to, I mean, some of the stuff he said in his opening statement, right? I mean, that you're not trying to we're not trying to talk to everybody at once, right? The entire family gathered together, right? You're just trying to talk to people who like already agree with a certain perspective. Well, look, for better or worse, I mean, that's true.
Absolutely.
Not even just about like, that's not only more true of like the kind of alternative media that we all hate on this, we all on the screen hate, right? You're like Tim Pools or whoever. That's even true of the kind of alternative media that we all like. right? You know, that it's not trying to talk to everybody at once. You know, that like, you know, I think, you know, like, I fucking love Jacobin. I've got like the, you know, I've half joked many times that if I'm like die unexpectedly, I want, you know, was on the masthead at Jacobin to be on my tombstone, you know, but like, very proud of the association, but like, you know, look, the Jacobin's certainly not like, you know, trying to appeal to every kind of reader at the same time, right? I mean, it's a very targeted thing, you know, and so like that one definitely applies even more so, probably like because the audiences are smaller, right? And also some of the stuff that's like some of the points about like the lack of incentives for fact checking your own stories, right, as opposed to fact checking the competition stories, probably apply more to certain kinds of alternative media. Like, I don't know. I mean, like I think some of the stuff I most hate now about mainstream media, like not like the sort of, you know, not like the reasons that like Noam Chomsky correctly hated mainstream media in 1985, which are, you know, a lot of those are still, you know, still apply, right? But like a lot of the recent stuff that I hate about mainstream media in some ways even kind of a product of it becoming a little bit more like a certain kind of alternative media, right? That it's like that, you know, the like shit where like reporters just kind of like, you know, dress up like, you know, what they saw on Twitter as a story, right? You know, without actually going out and like, you know, doing journalism to see if any of it's true.
Yeah, I think where I'm coming out of this debate from both of what you said there, Ben and Victor, in terms of like the impulses that drive alternative media being even sort of more troublesome and more accelerated. I think that's totally true. Like, I don't think necessarily that I would come out on favor of saying trust the alternative media, but that's also not what's on the table. I think at the end of the day, I'm still going to lean towards saying don't trust the mainstream media, because to be honest, it's felt like it's been a sort of one of the defining features of the left, like theoretically since at least the Frankfurt School and before that, and certainly politically, to have a healthy skepticism in the media and to see it as essentially an organ of the ruling class that is trying to sort of break solid worker solidarity and serve the interests of capital and the given set of like material relations of production. I think that's just a thing that we need to like maintain, but also not see it as static, see that, you know, workers can change it. That's where I say sort of healthy skepticism. And one of the things I worry about sort of this conversation and the broader like left conversation about this is I think we're afraid that the right is capturing this rhetorical space. Right. And I just feel us kind of walking away from it when I think we should be sort of even stepping further into it and saying, this is why you don't trust the mainstream media for these reasons, but also this is how you improve it.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's really, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think, yeah, and I guess this gets back to the point where, well, what does trust mean? Because I think trust probably comes in degrees. And I think Victor's point is really well taken, which is like, you know, on some level, if you don't trust the mainstream media at all, like even like the alternative media sources like Jacobin or like Democracy Now! Are going to rely to some extent on information that's relayed to the public by the mainstream media, and then they're going to give their own spin on it and their own take on it. So if you don't trust if you don't trust the mainstream media at all, you just can't trust any media at all, by and large, which is like a bad place to be. And I think maybe like the golden sort of medium where we want to be is like, you know, trusting the mainstream media enough such that we don't think that the information they're giving us is just like straight up wrong and like fabricated, but maybe we distrust the spin they're going to put on it or the context they're going to put it in just enough such that it drives us to, you know, other alternative media sources like, you know, a Jacobin or a Democracy Now! To get that information put in the context that we think is going to be like most informative, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I would also just say that I agree with Gordon that it's good to have healthy skepticism. And I think like that's true. I think the reason why like I'm not highlighting that as much is just because it's maybe like truism is maybe too strong of a word, but I just think as leftists, as a critical citizen, to some extent, it's a truism that any institution that has power, we should have a critical analysis of it, right? Like any instance, so like it's not even about the mainstream media. It's like we just should be thinking through, ideally, we should be critical and somewhat untrustworthy of any institution that has that. So I think the reason I'm more coming on the other side is just because I'm kind of thinking, well, yeah, of course we need to be critical. Like I'm kind of taking that as given. And then I'm saying, okay, but like in this narrower context, given that, should we, in this context, should we trust them? So maybe you and I are kind of hearing the question in like a slightly different context, if that makes sense. And then like the one other thing I would just say too is I think, to me, like a hallmark of what is a good source of news and information is like, can you tell a significant part of your audience things that they're not going to want to hear, right? And like, I feel like that's like some kind of a quick litmus test. Is this source saying things that a lot of their audience isn't going to like? And I think to some extent, because the mainstream media has all kinds of different stories, it does do that. But I think maybe like Matt Taibbi's point is well taken, that to some extent it's become more so where the media is scared to highlight things that their dominant audience isn't going to want to hear. And that's really like a bad thing, right? So
yeah, for sure. I do want to just say like there is part of what Gordon said that did resonate with me, and makes me think it's like, okay, so some of the case that like Victor's been making for trust the mainstream media in a certain way, it's like is right, but I wonder if it's like taking the question a little bit too literally, right? So
yeah.
like if the question is like literally like, hey, here's a New York Times story saying that like there was 10 people were shot in Paris yesterday, should I trust that that's true, right? Then like, yeah, you probably should, right? I mean, like, unless, one of these exceptions that you're talking about comes up where maybe you should like, be more skeptical of it. But it's like, sure, in a literal way, right? You probably can't, like Ethan was just saying, before the lizard people got me, like we probably like, if you don't trust the mainstream media at all, you've probably put yourself in a totally epistemically untenable position, and fair enough, right? That's right. But like, what Gordon was saying maybe made me wonder if like all of that's like taking the question a little bit too literally, right? Because it's like there's also a question of like, okay, should your sort of rhetorical posture, your kind of attitude, towards the mainstream media be one that's like more critical and and like has sort of emphasizes skepticism in a certain way, and is it like politically a good thing if the left isn't associated with that? And I think there's something to that concern that's like right, like, because I mean this is something that like, I mean, look, people do have a sense in that like media reflects powerful interests and like bullshits them. That's like not wrong. It's complicated in all the ways we've talked about today, but like it's not, it's not wrong. And it's like, and there is a phenomenon that I feel like I notice a lot, like, and maybe I don't know how much it matters because a lot of this is just me like being annoyed by shit I see on Twitter and like, who knows how reflective it is of anything else, but like of people who are like accounts I follow who are like, I don't know, like maybe they'll be like socialists, radicals, maybe you'll even have like the Hammer and Sickle, Twitter account or whatever, or like the little DSA Rose, that like spend a lot of time sort of responding to right wingers who are responding to the media. And like the right wingers will kind of say, like they'll like, okay, like a really good example would be, I remember there was this thing in the UK, there was this initiative about like restricted traffic flow to make cities more walkable. You weren't allowed to drive from one like zone to the other or something. I think this was maybe in Oxford, I don't remember, but anyway, they have that it's like Jordan Peterson like freaked out about it in a really over the top way, and I think parts of what he said were ridiculous, but it's like also everybody's response to is like, actually, dumbass, it's all they're doing is blah blah blah, and what gets totally lost is like, okay, but wait a second, so do we actually support that? Like
yeah.
Like, And I think I see a lot of that with media critique, that like, you know, that like right wingers will freak out about something in media, and like people spend so much time putting a plus wherever the people they hate most put a minus, right? They end up kind of defending, you know, like mainstream corporate medias in ways that's like, one, you maybe just shouldn't on its merits. Like in some of these cases, like just, you know, like just because a right winger says something, like that doesn't 100% of the time make it false. But like also is like probably not good just in that larger political sense that Gordon is speaking to. That's like, I mean, like you really want to like, is that the territory you want to stake out, right? You know, we're the people who think that the New York Times is fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, I think what I was saying when you kind of got kicked off your Wi-Fi again was just sort of that, like I think his point was really good, and just that as leftists, like we should be skeptical of any institution that has a lot of power, right? Like so it's like, you know, in some ways I see that overall skepticism ideal as just a good thing that should apply to everything, including the mainstream media. Mm-hmm. So maybe in the sense that I'm taking it literally, it's more that I think I'm really taking the question more as just like, compared to other things, it's probably fine. Compared to other things, but we should still, in an ideal world, of course, as leftists, be skeptical and critical of anything that exerts a lot of power.
Yeah, I think Victor and I are basically coming to the exact same conclusion, but saying a different thing because, to Ethan's point, the terms are just not defined. So that's what's so unproductive about the way that it's put.
Yeah, right. Like what's the... Like honestly, like a debate that I really want to see is like just literally just like have like the proposition could just be like, you know, Matt Taibbi's critique of mainstream media is largely fair and accurate.
Yeah, exactly. That would be good. I did appreciate
and then,
for like a second
Michelle Goldberg would still be disagreeing with it. At least you know exactly what they were arguing about.
Yeah, exactly. That would be better. I was just gonna say that I think like I did appreciate that Malcolm Gladwell did kind of like throw it, although it was kind of at a weird time when he like threw in, he's like, no one's defined what the mainstream media is yet also, and I was like, oh,
he also did it in a weird way, because it was like,
he did.
The side that doesn't want to trust the mainstream media hasn't defined mainstream media. Therefore, those of us who disagree with the statement, we shouldn't trust it.
Yeah,
but right, it's like, no, that cuts exactly equally both ways.
Yeah, as we've been saying all night, they've never defined alternative media.
That's true.
And none of the key terms of the debate have been defined. I mean, it's so confusing. I don't even know, like, it almost seems like when I hear debate, I think like dispute over proposition, but like, what's the proposition? It's not clear.
Yeah, totally. Like, and like, look, I mean, a lot of debates are like that to some extent or another, but there are degrees, and this is like particularly bad. Right?
Yeah.
Like the one I just did on Tuesday. This is why I'm still not back in Mexico yet. On Tuesday, I did this debate in person at the Texas Tech Law School in Lubbock with this like libertarian think tanker, and we'll probably play it not this Monday, but the Monday after on the show. The opening statement you can read in Jacobin, it went up today. But like in that debate, there's a point where like, you know, he was like kind of playing the hits. Right, you know, so it's like what are like all the, it's like, all right, we're gonna hear about Stalin, you know, we're gonna like, and what if it's like we're gonna hear about Venezuela, and like I was like trying to push him on like, okay, well, hold on, what's the like, because you know he wanted to like play all these games about how nobody wants to say Venezuela is socialist now that it's a mess. I was like, no, literally, just like tell me what your definition of socialism is that makes Venezuela socialist. And then we could talk about other countries in the world that might, like, you know, all these countries in Europe have more state ownership than Venezuela. So what socialism is, they're more socialist, you know, like, and that's like, so that's like an recent example in my experience of like that problem, right? You know, that like you never coming up in a lot of debates, but I agree it's like super bad in this one because it's like I don't know. I mean, at the risk of sounding like Jordan Peterson, right? You know, the do you believe in God? No, what does do mean? What does you mean? Right? I still think like it's like I don't really know what they like. I don't even feel like I have a good sense of what trust means to all the people on the stage. And then like mainstream media, I feel like I have at least more of an intuitive sense of what people are arguing about, but it would still be nice to clarify that. Like is Fox News mainstream media? Like it's not on YouTube, it's cable, it's one of the most popular news sources. Like so is that mainstream media, or do you really mean like liberalish mainstream media?
Yeah. I think Fox is definitely mainstream. It's got to be. I mean, if it's like the most popular news channel, like it has to be mainstream. But I mean, yeah. I know some people.
There are certainly people who use the term in a way that seems to exclude it.
Yeah, which I think is really weird. If like that's just like the liberal media, but clearly, like, I mean, especially Fox, like honestly, Fox, like it's reporters, like it's non like commentator people, like it's just a pretty normal like news organization as far as I know. Like it's just that their commentators are so like part of the brand, and like that's where all the viewers are. But
right,
no, they're normal reporting. When they used to have what's it called? They used to have that guy who was like the 60 Minutes son, or like Mike Wallace's son. I forgot like what his name is.
I know who you're talking about.
And he was like pretty normal.
Chris Wallace, is that who you mean?
Yeah, Chris Wallace.
Yeah.
Like, he was pretty normal, just like journalist, Like he was just nothing strange about him.
He was also, if I'm remembering the right guy, I feel like Chris Wallace was like, I definitely feel like I can remember some Fox segments where it was like bunches of talking heads together, like discussing something, and like Chris Wallace would be like the voice of sanity with like, his, like
yes,
what do you guys say?
Yeah.
And to the point about about like the reliability of these sources being accurate, like Fox News, I think, has like one of the most historically reliable polling institutions, like in terms of the polls that it puts out. So like I'm pretty sure that like on a technical reporting level, Fox News is pretty good, and then you get to the commentary and it's just Fox News.
Remember how mad like the commentators were when Fox News was like calling races like for the Democrats, right? Like they called Arizona, and they were
that
just
was
like,
the
like,
big
because their stats people are just like normal stats people. They're not like
that was the big exodus to Newsmax and OANN or whatever.
Which does
accurately.
Which, look, again, I do think Gordon is right, and I do try to keep that in mind. Most people are not like politics obsessed weirdos, but like also like as far as the case for like filtration bubbles, like that, that's got to be like a really powerful example of that. It's like, okay, this place that is manifestly overflowing with conservatives, their news desk isn't feeding me the version of reality I want. I'm going to find someplace that will.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
which is why.
Please.
Which is why I think that like the mark of a good, like reliable source of news, like a really fast litmus test I was saying before, is like, is this organization willing to tell you things that like you don't want to hear? Right. And like to me, like that's just like an important rule of thumb.
Totally. Well, in conclusion, we love Fox News. Save for the last few minutes. But we will finish this up same time next Thursday. On Monday's show, we are going to be on with Nick French from Jacobin to talk about socialism and analytic philosophy, and also we've got Eamon Hawk, who's the guy who does the Eamon animations, to talk about his new Yadolf video. So that one should be a lot of fun. Really looking forward to that. Thank you so much, Gordon, Victor, and Ethan. Call it there for tonight. Left is best.